He was just another retiree, living quietly in a house he and his late wife had built with decades of sacrifice. But when a smooth-talking salesman showed up his door, everything he worked for, his memories, his legacy, his home, was suddenly at risk. What began as a polite offer quickly spiraled into intimidation, false deadlines, and threats that preyed on his deepest fears. Yet behind the salesman's polished smile was a scheme larger than anyone imagined. How far would greed go to take advantage of the vulnerable? And what happens when a quiet man finally decides to fight back? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The street was quiet in a way only an older neighborhood could be, its rhythm slower, its noise softened by time. The maple trees that lined the sidewalks had grown thick over the years, their roots pushing through cracked pavement, their branches heavy enough to shade the faded houses beneath. Most of the families who once filled those homes had moved away, replaced by retirees who preferred silence to the restless energy of younger neighbors. On this street, people came and went without ceremony. Curtains twitched, lawnmowers hummed, mailboxes opened and closed at the weight of bills and folded coupons. At the far end of the block, in a small single-story home with peeling blue paint and a sagging fence, lived Mr. Wong. To many who passed by, he was just another old man, his figure bent by years, his footsteps steady but slow. He wore the same plain shirts and slacks, the kind that carried no fashion but much practicality. And he walked every morning with a cane that clicked against the concrete in even rhythm. Few noticed him except in glimpses, a gnawed exchange at the mailbox, a polite wave at the market, in the hurried eyes of the world. He was invisible, another pensioner tucked away in a house that looked too modest to be of interest. But inside his life, the days carried a weight and meaning that could not be seen from the street. Each morning began the same. Before sunrise, Mr. Wong filled a kettle and set it on the stove. The sound of boiling water had been his companion for decades, from the years when his wife prepared tea for both of them to the quiet mornings after she passed, when he carried on the ritual alone. He poured carefully, as if she were still across the table, and sat in silence while the steam curled into the dim kitchen light. He often traced his finger along the edge of the cup, remembering her hands, small and sure, folding dumpling wrappers or fixing his collar before he left for work. Work had defined most of his life. For 40 years he labored at a textile factory, rising before dawn, returning after dark, his body carrying the stiffness of repetition. Every thread of his home had been bought with overtime shifts and callous hands. The mortgage payments, made month after month, had been a badge of honor, proof that the family could rise on its own without handouts or debts. He had framed the deed once the house was finally his, tucking it safely in a drawer as though it were as sacred as a family portrait. Now, that house was his anchor in a world that moved too quickly, where so much of what he had known was disappearing. Neighbors rarely thought of that history when they saw him sweeping the sidewalk or trimming the hedges. They saw an old man filling the hours, not a widower tending to the last evidence of a lifetime's work. The small gestures, the way he replaced every warped fence slap by hand, the way he polished the brass number plate above the door, were not for show. They were quiet acts of defiance against forgetting, against the erosion of time that wanted to take everything he and his wife had built. On Sundays, he sat on the porch with a newspaper folded neatly in his lap. The children who biked past hardly noticed him, except when their wheels rattled over the broken pavement near his gate. Sometimes they would wave, and he would raise a hand in return, but often they kept going, unaware that the man behind the paper had once carried his own children along those same sidewalks, steadying them when they wobbled, cheering when they found their balance. To Mr. Wong, the house was not just lumber and plaster. It was memory layered in walls and floorboards, laughter sealed into paint, arguments softened by years. In the kitchen hung a clock his wife had chosen, its hands still ticking though the numbers had faded. The bedroom dresser still held the scent of the lavender soap she loved. The garden, though overgrown, carried traces of her care in every stubborn rose bush that refused to die. To strangers, the house looked tired. To him, it was alive. And yet, the world had a way of treating men like him, as though they were already gone. Sales flyers filled his mailbox for senior downsizing solutions. Real estate agents left business cards tucked under his mat, promising quick sales and easy cash. Even the city sent notices about code updates and rising property taxes, reminders that nothing stayed still forever. The quiet that Mr. Wong valued also made him a target, though he did not yet know it. To those who watched from outside, he was not a man guarding memories. He was a widowed retiree alone in a house that someone else might want more. Still, each evening as the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched across the street, he watered the plants by the porch and stood for a moment looking at the home he had kept. His neighbors walked past without stopping. The world kept moving, and Mr. Wong remained a figure half hidden in routine. But in his silence, in the small rituals repeated every day, there was strength, a quiet that was not emptiness, but endurance, waiting for the moment when someone would mistake it for weakness and try to take what was his. The morning had begun like any other. The kettle hissed on the stove, the faint scent of tea leaves filled the kitchen, and Mr. Wong sat at the small wooden table with the newspaper folded neatly in front of him. The quietness of his house was something he had learned to live with, though it still carried echoes of voices that no longer filled the rooms. He sipped his tea slowly, staring at the words without really reading them, when the sound of footsteps broke through the calm. Not the familiar shuffle of a neighbor walking by, but firmer, quicker rhythm that approached with purpose. The knock came sharp and confident. 3 raps against a faded blue door. It startled him enough that the spoon in his cup clinked against porcelain. Visitors were rare. His daughter called before stopping by, and the neighbors, mostly retirees like himself, had long since abandoned the habit of unannounced calls. Setting down his cup, he rose slowly, his cane tapping against the floor as he made his way to the entryway. Through the thin curtain over the glass, he saw a figure standing tall on the porch, shoulders squared, briefcase in hand. The man's suit was immaculate, gray with a sheen that caught the sunlight. His tie knotted so precisely it seemed to have been measured. His hair was slicked back, his shoes polished until they reflected the porch railing. Mr. Wong hesitated for a moment before pulling the door open. The salesman's smile spread quickly, bright but calculated, the kind of smile that seemed practiced in mirrors. "Good morning, sir," the man said warmly, his voice carrying the tone of someone who wanted to sound familiar without ever having met you. "Mr. Wong, I presume?" Mr. Wong gripped the edge of the doorframe, unsure how the stranger knew his name. "Yes," he said cautiously. "What is it you need?" The salesman's eyes flicked briefly past him into the house, cataloging its age, the scuffed floors visible in the hallway, the peeling paint on the door. Then he turned his attention back to Mr. Wong with a sympathetic tilt of his head. "I work with homeowners in the area, retirees like yourself," he said smoothly, flipping open a leather folio to reveal neatly stacked pamphlets. "We specialize in property protection services. With taxes going up, maintenance costs skyrocketing, and city codes changing almost every year, many seniors find themselves struggling to keep their homes. I'm here to offer solutions before problems arise." The words fell quickly, wrapped in the language of reassurance. Mr. Wong listened politely, his brow furrowed. He had heard similar tones before, men who once sold factory insurance policies in his younger years, each one promising safety while angling for commission. "I've managed this house a long time," Mr. Wong said, his voice steady but guarded. "It is fine." The salesman chuckled lightly, as though brushing aside an old friend's stubbornness. Of course. You've done a wonderful job, Mr. Wong. But you know how it is. The city doesn't see history the way you do. They see cracked sidewalks, old wiring, outdated plumbing. All it takes is one inspection, one letter, and suddenly you're facing fines or worse." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "I've seen people lose their homes overnight. It's heartbreaking." The phrasing was careful, meant to stir unease. Mr. Wong shifted his weight on the cane, not replying right away. The salesman took silence as opportunity, sliding one of the pamphlets forward. It was glossy, covered with pictures of smiling older couples shaking hands with younger men in suits. Bold letters promised peace of mind and secure ownership. "What we do," the man continued, "is simple. We place safeguards around your property, legal, financial, structural, so that no one, not even the city, can take it from you. You sign a simple agreement, and we take care of the rest. No stress, no worry. The smile never left his face, though his eyes seemed sharper, calculating Mr. Wong's hesitation. Mr. Wong picked up the pamphlet, turning it over slowly. His English was good, but the legal phrases swirled into a tangle of promises too smooth to be trusted. He set it back into the salesman's hands without comment. "My house has stood for 50 years, he said firmly. "It will stand for longer." The salesman's grin faltered for the briefest second before recovering. "That's exactly why I'm here, to make sure it stays that way. Think of it as insurance, one small step today to avoid big problems tomorrow. Many of your neighbors have already taken advantage of our services. I wouldn't want you left unprotected." His words hung in the air, heavy with implied threat, disguised as kindness. Mr. Wong's chest tightened slightly. There was something in the man's tone, beneath the polish, that revealed not concern but hunger. The old man adjusted his grip on the cane. "I will think," he said quietly, and began to close the door. The salesman kept his smile, but pressed a business card into the doorframe before it shut. "Of course, Mr. Wong. Take your time. But don't wait too long. These opportunities don't last forever." The latch clicked into place, and silence returned to the house. Mr. Wong stood for a moment, staring at the card now resting on his entryway table. Its gold lettering gleamed under the light, promising safety but leaving a bitter unease. He returned to the kitchen, but the tea had grown cold. The next morning, the salesman returned. The same sharp knock rattled the door, and when Mr. Wong opened it, there he stood again, suit pressed, tie crisp, smile practiced. In his hand was a different folder this time, thicker, as though he had come armed with proof. "Good to see you again, Mr. Wong," he said with the tone of someone who assumed welcome. "I know you wanted time to think, and that's wise. But I'd be remiss if I didn't make sure you had the full picture. May I?" Mr. Wong hesitated. His instinct told him no, but his upbringing, the old habit of politeness, made him step aside. The salesman entered quickly, as if expecting the answer, his eyes scanning the house with the precision of a man cataloging weaknesses. He set his folder on the kitchen table and opened it with a flourish, revealing charts, graphs, and official-looking notices. "Property taxes in this district have gone up 17% in the last 5 years. He began smoothly, tapping a page with his pen. "And according to projections, these here are from the county assessor's office. They're set to rise even faster. You may think you can handle it now, but what about in 2 years? 5 years? The city doesn't care that you're retired. They'll raise and raise until people like you simply can't keep up." His words came in waves, designed to overwhelm. Mr. Wong sipped his tea quietly, his brow furrowing but his lips pressed together. "And it's not just taxes," the salesman continued. He flipped to another page, this one a chart filled with red arrows pointing upward. "Utilities, maintenance, emergency repairs. Did you know that replacing an old roof like yours could cost upwards of $20,000? One inspection, Mr. Wong, one notice in the city, and suddenly you're staring at costs no pension can handle." He leaned back, shaking his head as though the injustice pained him personally. "It's not right, I agree with you, but it's reality, and reality doesn't wait until we're ready." Mr. Wong glanced at the papers but said nothing. The salesman took silence as invitation. "That's where we come in. Our protection plans are designed specifically for homeowners in your position. We shield you from tax hikes by consolidating payments. We take on maintenance obligations, ensuring you'll never face sudden bills. And most importantly," here he paused, lowering his voice as though confiding a secret, "we put safeguards on the deed. That way, no one, not even the city, can force you out. You'll stay here for as long as you wish, guaranteed." The words were wrapped in authority. Each phrase rehearsed to sound official. Each sentence crafted to plant a seed of fear. He slid a glossy brochure forward. On its cover, an elderly couple smiled in front of a large, well-kept home. Beneath them, bold letters read, "Astra Security for Seniors. Stability for Families. Asterisk." Mr. Wong picked it up, the paper too slick, the images too polished. He set it down again. "I have paid my taxes every year," he said slowly. "I keep my home. Why would the city take it?" The salesman gave a sympathetic chuckle. Because they can. I've seen it, Mr. Wong. Elderly folks, hardworking, honest, just like you, they miss one payment. Or the property fails an inspection. Suddenly liens are placed. Courts get involved. Before they know it, their homes are gone. And believe me, developers are circling. They want neighborhoods like this. To them, you're just standing in the way. His words sharpened, the smile hardening at the edges. I don't want to see that happen to you. Mr. Wong's grip tightened around his cane. He remembered years of work at the factory, years of sweat poured into every payment that bought this home. He remembered his wife's laughter in the garden, his children's footsteps running down the hall. This house was more than numbers. But the man's words dug at his confidence, wrapping ordinary worries in language that felt official, urgent. What exactly is your plan? Mr. Wong asked, his voice calm but edged with doubt. The salesman's smile widened again, sensing progress. He produced a single sheet of paper, its text small and dense. It's very straightforward. You sign here, and we assume the burdens of tax increases and major repairs. You pay a fixed, predictable amount each month. No surprises. No risk of losing your home. Mr. Wong's eyes moved over the print, but the words blurred together. Legal terms crowded the page, clauses written to confuse. He noticed the phrase transfer of ownership rights buried halfway down, but the salesman's finger moved quickly, drawing his attention away. Don't worry about the fine print, the man said smoothly. That's just standard language. What matters is the protection it offers. Peace of mind. Security. Isn't that what we all want? He leaned closer, lowering his voice again. Look, I'll be honest with you. Most people your age wait too long. They think they can manage, until suddenly it's too late. Then it's the courts, the banks, and nothing can be done. I don't want you to make that mistake. Sign today, and you can stop worrying. Forever. The kitchen felt smaller with him there, his voice filling every corner. His paper spread like a trap across the table. Mr. Wong said nothing. The salesman's smile never wavered, but his eyes watched closely, measuring hesitation, preparing for the final push. Outside, the neighborhood remained quiet. Inside, a battle was being waged silently over a man's house, fought not with weapons but with words dressed as promises. Promises too good to be true. The salesman's papers still lay on the kitchen table long after he had left, their glossy edges catching the light of the afternoon sun. Mr. Wong sat staring at them, not reading, not touching, but remembering. The man's words echoed in his ears. The warnings of rising taxes, the threats of sudden inspections, the promise that only a signature could guarantee safety. They were delivered with such certainty, with such smoothness, that anyone who wanted to believe might have done so easily. But as Mr. Wong sat alone, his mind traveled backward, not to numbers and contracts, but to voices from his childhood. He had grown up in Chinatown, decades earlier, when his father still ran a small grocery on a narrow street that smelled of roasted chestnuts and dried fish. The buildings were close together, laundry hung from balconies, and old men played cards under strings of red lanterns that never seemed to burn out. Life was simple but never easy. Rent was always due. Inspectors always came, and men in press coats appeared from time to time with schemes that promised relief. His father used to warn him about those men. They smiled too much, his father would say in Cantonese, stacking crates of vegetables behind the counter. When a man smiles so hard his teeth show, but his eyes do not, he is hiding something. You must always watch the eyes. Mr. Wong remembered one such day vividly. He had been barely 10 years old, sitting on a stool behind the counter, when a tall stranger in a hat had entered the store. The man wore a fine suit, spoke perfect English, and carried a clipboard thick with papers. He introduced himself as a representative from a business association, claiming he could help struggling shopkeepers. His father had stood politely, listening as the man spoke of rising rents, of city regulations, of how Chinatown small businesses were at risk unless they joined his association. Membership, of course, required fees, and once signed, shopkeepers would find themselves trapped in contracts that drained their earnings while offering no real protection. His father had seen through it immediately. He had laughed softly, shaking his head, before ushering the man out with a simple phrase, We've been here long enough to know your kind." Later, when the boy asked how he had known, his father told him the tricksters who had always hovered on the edges of immigrant life, loan sharks who demanded impossible payments, fake inspectors who claimed shops would be shut down unless bribes were paid, middlemen who promised opportunity but delivered debt. "They come dressed as helpers," his father said, "but they feed only on fear." Sitting now in his kitchen, Mr. Wong realized the salesman who had just left was no different. The suit was newer, the folders shinier, the language polished with modern phrases. But the heart of it was the same. Exploit fear, promise safety, hide the trap in paper no ordinary man could fully understand. He could almost hear his father's voice saying again, "Watch the eyes." And indeed, he remembered how the salesman's eyes had flickered when Mr. Wong had asked why the city would take his home. The mouth had smiled, but the eyes had grown sharp, impatient, revealing the hunger behind the mask. Mr. Wong rose from the table and walked slowly to the drawer in the hallway, where he kept old photographs. He pulled one free, an image of his father standing proudly in front of the grocery. His shirt sleeves were rolled, his hair slicked neatly back, his expression calm but firm. The boy who had once stood beside him had not understood the weight of those warnings, but now, in his own old age, he felt the wisdom settle heavy on his shoulders. The world had changed around him. The neon signs of Chinatown had faded, the grocery long gone, the neighborhood replaced with glass towers and parking garages. But the tricksters remained, only shifting their disguises with time. Once it was a man in a hat selling memberships. Now it was a salesman in a modern suit offering protection plans. Different faces, different words, but the same shadow underneath. He set the photograph down and returned to the table. The papers still gleamed, promising peace of mind. He pushed them into a neat pile, then slid them aside. He would not sign anything. He would not let history repeat itself so easily. Yet doubt still lingered. The salesman's warnings of inspections and rising taxes gnawed at him in the quiet. What if this time there was truth buried among the lies? What if the city really could take everything he had built? His father had been strong enough to turn men like that away. Would he be? The kettle whistled again, pulling him back to the present. He poured another cup of tea, his hand steady but his mind unsettled. He told himself that some lessons never grew old. Tricksters thrived only when fear was allowed to grow. If he remembered his father's words, if he trusted his own judgment, he could resist. Still, as the steam rose from the cup, he glanced once more at the business card left on his table. The gold lettering glimmered, waiting, like bait cast into water, patient for the moment when a tired man might give in. Outside, the street was quiet again, but in Mr. Wong's mind the echoes of the past stirred restlessly, reminding him that battles his father had fought in crowded streets half a century ago were still being waged, now in kitchens like his own. The faces had changed, but the danger had not. The morning after the salesman's second visit, Mr. Wong stepped outside to sweep his walkway, as he always did. The broom scraped gently against the pavement, pushing aside leaves that had gathered overnight. The air was cool, the kind of crispness that made each breath feel sharper, and the neighborhood was waking slowly. A car started at the far end of the street, a dog barked twice, and a pair of sparrows flitted between the branches of the old maple tree that leaned over his fence. It was ordinary, almost comforting, until he noticed two of his neighbors standing by the corner mailbox, speaking in hushed tones that carried more weight than their words suggested. Mrs. Alvarez, who lived 3 doors down, clutched her cardigan tight against her shoulders. Her voice, though low, carried across the quiet street. "He came to me last year, you know? Same suit, same papers. Promised the city would forgive my property fines if I signed with him. I nearly did. Nearly." Beside her, Mr. Carter adjusted his cap, his wrinkled face drawn tight. "He tried with me, too," he muttered. "Said I could get cash up front for the house, that it would save my kids the trouble later. Told him to get off my porch before I called the police. Didn't like the way he kept smiling, like he already owned the place." The broom paused in Mr. Wong's hands. He lowered his eyes, continuing the sweeping motion, though the leaves barely moved. Their voices were not meant for him, not directly, yet they reached him all the same. He felt a faint tightening in his chest, the recognition that he was not the first, nor the only target. A part of him wanted to step forward, to ask what exactly had happened, to admit that the man had come to him too. But his feet stayed rooted where they were, his pride holding him still. He had lived on this street for nearly 40 years. Neighbors came and went, but he remained. To reveal that he had entertained such a man, even for a few minutes, felt like admitting weakness. He told himself it was nothing, just a visitor with smooth words. Yet the memory of those papers on his table, the salesman's voice threading warnings into his mind, weighed on him heavier than the broom he held. Later that afternoon, he saw Mrs. Kim from across the street, speaking to another retiree by her front gate. Her voice was sharper, tinged with anger. They go after people like us because they think we're alone. My cousin in the next town lost her house that way, signed something she didn't understand, and by the time her daughter found out, it was too late. Gone. Just gone. The words stung, though they were not aimed at him. Mr. Wong nodded politely as he passed, his cane tapping softly against the pavement. He felt the pull to pause, to ask, to share, but each time he swallowed the words. Politeness restrained him, but beneath it was something else, a deeper reluctance. To admit his doubt would mean admitting he had been shaken, that he let the man's promises find a crack in his certainty. At home, the silence of his kitchen pressing on him again. He poured tea but left it untouched. The card the salesman had left still sat on the counter, its edges too clean against the worn wood. He turned it over once, twice, before tucking it under the newspaper, as though hiding it would lessen its pull. He told himself that if his neighbors had turned the man away, then he could do the same. Yet their whispered warnings replayed in his head with uncomfortable clarity. When evening fell, he sat on the porch as he often did, watching the street darken. Lights blinked on in neighboring houses, faint squares of yellow against the dusk. Somewhere down the block, laughter drifted from a television set. The neighborhood was alive in its quiet way, a collection of people bound together by proximity and age, each guarding their own routines. And still, beneath the calm, he felt the undercurrent of whispers, carrying stories of loss and deceit. He wondered if they all knew he had spoken with the salesman. If, behind their polite waves and small talk, they guessed that he let the man's words linger in his mind longer than they should have. Shame pressed against him, though no one had accused him of anything. He thought again of his father's warnings, of tricksters who preyed on fear, and he reminded himself he was not a child anymore. He should know better. He wanted to believe he did know better. But the unease remained unspoken, hidden even from those who might have understood best. In the stillness, he whispered to himself in Cantonese, a phrase his father used often, "Hold your ground." It was meant to steady him, though it sounded fragile in the empty air. Tomorrow would bring another knock, another smile, another wave of promises. And though his neighbors had already named the danger for what it was, Mr. Wong kept his doubts locked behind closed doors, carried silently like the weight of his years. The third visit came on a day when the sky hung low with gray clouds, the kind that seemed to press down on the street, muting every sound. Mr. Wong had just finished folding laundry when the knock rattled his door again. Firm, deliberate, the kind that made it clear the visitor would not leave easily. He opened it slowly, and there stood the salesman once more, suit as crisp as if it had just been pulled from a store window. His smile carried no fatigue, only the same polished warmth, as though every knock, every introduction, was practiced anew. "I won't take much of your time today, Mr. Wong," the man began, his tone casual but his eyes alert. "I just thought I'd bring by some paperwork, so you can see exactly how simple this all is." Before Mr. Wong could answer, the salesman was already stepping across the threshold, briefcase in hand. He moved with the confidence of someone who expected permission would follow his presence. At the kitchen table, he set down the case, clicked it open, and pulled out a neat stack of papers bound with a black clip. The pages fanned out in front of Mr. Wong, like a spread of playing cards. "These are just standard maintenance agreements," he explained, sliding one forward. "All routine, nothing complicated. What they do is consolidate your responsibilities into one fixed plan. You don't have to worry about taxes jumping, repairs piling up, or unexpected city notices. Everything is handled in advance. The salesman tapped the top page with his pen, his movements precise, as though directing attention to where he wanted Mr. Wong's eyes to land. Here, for example, he continued, this clause ensures that your monthly payments stay flat. No inflation surprises. Doesn't that sound easier? Mr. Wong adjusted his glasses, leaning closer to the paper. The text swam before him, dense with language that seemed designed to obscure. Words like transfer, assignment, beneficiary rights, and trustee authority wove through the lines like threads in a net. He tried to follow, but every sentence branched into another, each clause branching still further, until the meaning slipped away entirely. The salesman noticed his hesitation and filled the silence quickly. Don't worry about the fine print, Mr. Wong. It's all legal boilerplate. Every contract has it. What matters is the peace of mind it brings you. Imagine never having to scramble for money when the city demands an inspection. Imagine knowing that no matter what happens, this house remains secure. The phrasing was careful, always circling back to fear, then offering relief. The salesman's pen hovered above the signature line, as if waiting for the old man's hand to move. Mr. Wong's throat felt dry. He remembered his father's warning about eyes that smiled less than mouths. He lifted his gaze and found the salesman watching him too closely, too intently, the smile still fixed but the eyes sharp with calculation. This part, Mr. Wong said slowly, pointing to a section halfway down the page. What does it mean? The salesman leaned in, brushing it off with a laugh. That? Just technical language about transferring certain responsibilities. It allows us to act on your behalf, to negotiate with the city, to keep everything in order. Think of it as power of attorney, but only for the house. Saves you the stress. The words slipped out smoothly, but the unease in Mr. Wong's chest deepened. Power of attorney was not small. He had seen friends lose control of their affairs once such papers were signed. The salesman's pen moved again, underlining phrases in bold, distracting him from the hidden traps buried beneath. Look here, the man urged. Maintenance coverage, tax relief options, emergency repair fund, all rolled into one. You've worked hard all your life, Mr. Wong. You deserve to rest. Let us handle the burdens for you. The old man's fingers tapped lightly on the table. He thought of his wife's rose bushes in the garden, still stubbornly blooming each spring despite his clumsy care. He thought of the years spent bent over factory machines, each coin earned and saved to make sure this house could belong to his family. He thought of neighbors' whispers, of losses they could not undo once papers were signed. He looked again at the signature line. His name was already typed neatly beneath, waiting only for ink to make it binding. The salesman leaned back slightly, confident, the pen extended across the table like an offering. Most of your neighbors have already secured their agreements, he said in a voice almost gentle. Don't be the one left unprotected. These opportunities don't last forever. The room felt close, the air heavy with pressure disguised as kindness. Mr. Wong set his hands firmly on the table, but did not reach for the pen. I will read, he said, his voice quiet but steady. The salesman's smile flickered for the briefest moment before returning, polished once more. Of course. Take your time, but don't wait too long. The sooner you sign, the sooner you can stop worrying. He gathered the papers into a neat pile, leaving them squarely in the center of the table. With a nod, he closed his briefcase and rose to leave. At the door, he paused, the smile tightening just slightly. I'll check back soon, Mr. Wong. I know you'll make the smart choice. When the door closed behind him, silence returned. The stack of papers remained, stark against the worn wood of the table, their fine print glinting faintly in the dim light. Mr. Wong sat alone, staring at them, the unease in his chest heavier now than ever. He knew, without reading further, that signing would mean handing over more than he could afford to lose. And yet, the weight of his doubt pressed against him, whispering that perhaps the salesman's promises were not entirely lies. The paper sat untouched as evening fell, silent but insistent, waiting for his hand. The following Saturday, the house filled briefly with a liveliness it rarely knew. May arrived just before noon, her car pulling into the driveway with its familiar rattle, the sound of the engine cutting into the stillness of the street. She carried grocery bags in both hands, her face flushed from the weight, strands of hair escaping her ponytail as she climbed the porch steps. Mr. Wong opened the door before she could knock, his hand tightening on the cane, though his smile came easily when he saw her. "Baba," she said warmly, brushing past him into the kitchen. "You didn't tell me you needed rice. You should call me when you run out." She began unpacking the bags, moving with a rhythm that suggested long habit. Vegetables, soy sauce, tea leaves, even pastries from the bakery she knew he liked, all lined up neatly on the counter. Mr. Wong watched in silence, touched by her thoughtfulness, though guilt stirred quietly in his chest. He knew she already carried enough weight with her own family, her own children. He didn't want her worrying about him. He busied himself with putting the kettle on the stove, but May's eyes, sharper than he wished, scanned the kitchen as she worked. It didn't take her long to notice the stack of papers on the table. The salesman had left them their days earlier, their edges too neat against the worn surface. She froze mid-motion, a head of bok choy still in her hand, and crossed to the table. "What's this?" she asked, her tone already edged with suspicion. Mr. Wong turned, his shoulders stiffening. "Nothing. Just some papers a man brought. I haven't signed." May flipped through the pages quickly, her brow furrowing as the dense legal language blurred past her eyes. She had seen contracts before, mortgages, leases, insurance policies, but these were different. Each line seemed loaded with phrases that sounded protective but hinted at something else beneath. Words like transfer of ownership and beneficiary rights stood out. She looked up sharply. "Baba, where did these come from? Who gave them to you?" He waved a hand dismissively, settling into his chair with a sigh. "A man. Salesman. He says he helps old people like me. Taxes, repairs. I didn't ask, he just comes." May set the papers down, her jaw tight. "These aren't help. These are traps. You signed this. You could lose the house. Don't you see?" Her voice was urgent, but he did not meet her eyes. Instead, he stared at the kettle, listening to the water begin its low hum before the boil. I know. I didn't sign. I won't sign." "Then why are they still here?" she pressed. Mr. Wong's hands rested on the table, steady but heavy. He thought of all the years it had taken to secure this home, every hour in the factory, every coin saved. He thought of his wife, gone now, who had told him this house would always be their anchor. And yet, he also thought of the salesman's words, of taxes rising, of repairs he knew he could not afford if the roof gave way or the plumbing failed. "I don't want to be a burden, May," he said quietly, almost too softly to hear. She blinked, her anger faltering at the rawness of his tone. "A burden? Baba, you're not a burden. This is your home. You worked for it. You built this life for us." He shook his head slightly. "You have your family. Children. I see how busy you are. I don't want you to worry about me. If something happens to the house, if the city comes, better I handle it now than later." The kettle whistled sharply, filling the silence. May moved to take it off the stove, her hands trembling as she poured the water into the teapot. She set the cups down harder than she meant to, the porcelain clinking against the table. "You think signing this will protect me? Protect us?" she asked, her voice quieter now but heavy with emotion. "It wouldn't. It would take everything away. And then where would you be? Where would we be?" Mr. Wong sipped his tea slowly, the steam rising to blur his expression. He didn't answer right away. The shame of admitting how close he had come to believing the salesman gnawed at him. He wanted to tell her he was strong enough, that he still understood the tricks of the world. But instead he said only, "I will be careful." May reached across the table, her hand covering his. "Promise me you won't sign anything. Not without me looking first. Promise." He met her gaze then, her eyes fierce with the same determination her mother once carried. Slowly he nodded. "I promise." Yet as the paper sat between them, untouched but not destroyed, both knew the promise was fragile. The danger lingered, waiting for the next knock on the door. The memory of sacrifice clung to Mr. Wong like the scent of machine oil that had once soaked into his skin, a smell that never seemed to leave even after decades had passed. The factory floor had been his world for most of his youth and middle years, a cavern of noise with a pounding of presses and a hiss of steam became the rhythm of his days. He would rise before dawn, long before his neighbors' windows flickered with light, and make his way through the streets still heavy with fog. His lunch, packed by his late wife in those early years, was nothing more than rice, vegetables, and sometimes a bit of pork if they could afford it. But it was enough to keep him moving through shifts that stretched 12, sometimes 14 hours, his hands red and raw from endless labor. The factory was no place for dreams. Men bent their backs over machines that did not care whether they lived or broke, and foremen barked at them with voices sharpened by impatience. Accidents were common. Mr. Wong had seen men lose fingers, heard the cries when a sleeve caught in the gears. But still he stayed, because every hour, every blister, was money set aside for something larger. In those days, he carried a small notebook in his breast pocket. Inside, he kept columns of numbers, every wage recorded, every expense noted, every coin balanced. The house was only a thought then, a vision of brick, and where his family could live without the fear of rent hikes or sudden eviction. In Chinatown, where his father had once rented rooms crowded with cousins and uncles, there was always the shadow of instability. One month the landlord was kind, the next he doubled the rent. Families moved in the night, carrying what they could on their backs, children crying as they left behind familiar streets. Mr. Wong swore he would not live like that. His children would grow up knowing a home that could not be taken with a signature on someone else's paper. He remembered the ache in his bones after double shifts, how he would stumble through the door past midnight and find his wife waiting with a basin of warm water for his hands. She would rub the stiffness from his fingers, scold him gently for working too hard, then whisper encouragement. He carried with him back to the factory the next day. She believed in the house even more than he did, reminding him that every sacrifice had its place, that the sweat on his brow was not wasted, but turned slowly into foundation of a future. When the children were young, he would sometimes return home too tired to speak, but he never forgot to place a few coins into the jar on the shelf. May, wide-eyed and curious, once asked why he always did that. He told her it was a promise, that the coins were bricks, and one day they would build something real with them. She had nodded solemnly, as if she understood, and in her child's way, she began slipping in coins too, pennies found on sidewalks, nickels given by relatives. It took years, decades even, but the house finally came within reach. He remembered the day he walked into the bank, hat in his hands, shirt pressed carefully though his palms sweated through it. The loan officer looked at him with mild surprise when he presented the down payment. Every penny counted from years of relentless saving. The house itself was modest, a squat structure with peeling paint and a yard in need of care, but to Mr. Wong it was a palace. The day the keys were placed in his hand, he felt the weight of his father's history lift from his shoulders. No landlord could ever force him into the street again. Now, sitting in the quiet of his kitchen with the salesman's papers still lurking nearby, those memories returned with sharp clarity. Every page in that stack was a threat to undo the lifetime of sacrifice he had carried on his back. Each clause written in tiny print seemed designed to erase the nights in the factory, the coins in the jar, the whispered encouragement of his wife. The house was not simply wood and plaster. It was decades of endurance, proof that he had carved a piece of permanence from a world that wanted men like him to remain invisible and disposable. Mr. Wong sipped his tea slowly, his mind drifting between then and now. His knuckles still ached on rainy days, reminders of machines that had demanded so much of him. His lungs carried the memory of dust, his shoulders the weight of years spent hunched over conveyor belts. To let go of the house would be to betray every version of himself that had endured so that this moment of ownership could exist. It was a betrayal he could not bear, even as the salesman's promises whispered at the edges of his doubts. He thought again of May, her eyes sharp as she read through the fine print, her voice fierce when she told him not to sign. Perhaps she had inherited more of her mother's steel than he realized. Perhaps the sacrifice had not been in vain, if it had taught her to guard what he had built. But the fear still lingered, a fear he could not voice easily, that the years ahead might bring burdens he could no longer carry, and that the home he had bled for could still slip away if he made the wrong choice. The following week, the salesman returned as though the house were already his to walk into. His knock was brisk, almost impatient. And when Mr. Wong opened the door, the man's smile carried none of the warmth it had before. It was too sharp, too quick, a smile crafted to disarm rather than a welcome. He stepped inside with a stack of folders pressed neatly beneath his arm, papers that seemed heavier than they should be, and laid them on the table with the casual certainty of someone delivering inevitability rather than choice. Mr. Wong watched him, his hands folded in front of him, the steam from his untouched tea rising between them like a fragile barrier. The salesman wasted no time. His words came clipped, precise, each syllable designed to pierce. He spoke of new regulations that would soon take effect, citing numbers and phrases that sounded official but meant little when strung together. According to him, the city had adopted a stricter policy on senior properties, a phrase Mr. Wong had never heard before, and homes owned by retirees would now be subject to immediate review for underutilization. If the city determined the property was inefficiently managed, it could be seized, restructured, or resold. The salesman let the words hang in the air, heavy with implied authority, as though he were delivering news from a government office rather than concocting a fiction tailored to prey on fear. Mr. Wong sat very still, listening as the man described what would happen if he failed to act. First, he said, a letter would arrive from the city. Then inspectors would come, poking around the house, making judgments. Finally, with little warning, an order of seizure would follow. You could wake up one morning and find the locks changed, the salesman warned. His tone was almost sympathetic, but the glint in his eyes betrayed the performance. I don't want that for you, Mr. Wong. That's why I'm here, to make sure you're protected. The papers spread across the table, like a trap disguised as salvation. There were highlighted sections, bolded phrases about protection agreements, and priority status. The salesman's pen tapped against the signature line with insistent rhythm, as if each strike carried a countdown. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice to a confidential whisper, saying the city was moving quickly and deadlines were approaching. If you don't act now, you'll lose everything. But if you sign today, I can guarantee your home stays safe. Mr. Wong's chest tightened with a familiar weight of doubt. He had lived long enough to recognize the cadence of pressure, the way fear was being woven into each sentence. Yet the words also stirred unease, because the man's confidence was unwavering, his details so specific. He thought of the letters he had once received from tax offices, full of jargon and small print that required hours of careful reading. It was not impossible that new rules had been written in similar ink, that some shift in policy had targeted people like him. He frowned, not because he believed the salesman entirely, but because he could not afford to dismiss the possibility outright. The salesman watched the hesitation and pressed harder. He painted pictures of government officials combing through neighborhoods, marking down names of elderly owners who had too much space. He spoke of bureaucrats looking for easy wins, and Mr. Wong, living alone in a house larger than what he seemed to need, fit the image perfectly. The man's voice grew urgent, rehearsed panic dripping from every syllable. You've worked your whole life for this place. Don't let them take it from you. Sign today and I'll take care of the rest. For a moment, silence stretched across the kitchen, broken only by the faint tick of the clock on the wall. Mr. Wong glanced at the papers again, at the lines of fine print that blurred under his aging eyes. He thought of the factory floor, the sweat and years that had built this home brick by brick in his imagination long before he bought it. The salesman's words clawed that foundation, suggesting it could all vanish with the stroke of some faceless official's pen. His fingers twitched slightly against the table, as though testing the weight of decision, while the salesman's pen hovered above the paper, like a blade poised to fall. The pressure in that moment was suffocating. Mr. Wong could feel the walls of his own home closing in on him, the sanctuary he had fought for now transformed into a battlefield of persuasion. The salesman smiled again, broader now, sensing victory. But behind that smile was the same hunger Mr. Wong had heard in stories told by his father, the same hunger of men who wore fine clothes while carving away at the dignity of others. He breathed slowly, letting the salesman's words settle like dust, knowing that once dust cleared, the truth had a way of revealing itself. The cultural center smelled faintly of incense and old wood, the kind of place that carried memory in its walls. On weekday afternoons, it was usually quiet, a space for calligraphy classes or Tai Chi practice. But tonight the chairs had been pulled into rows and the lights left brighter than usual. Mr. Wong took a seat near the back, his hands folded neatly in his lap, eyes scanning the room. He recognized many of the faces, neighbors, acquaintances, people he had seen in grocery aisles or walking their dogs. But they looked different gathered here. Their expressions were drawn tight, their voices low, carrying an undercurrent of unease that filled the hall even before the meeting began. The organizer, a retired teacher named Mrs. Chung, stood at the front with a microphone that buzzed faintly whenever she adjusted it. Her hair was pulled back neatly, her glasses sliding low on her nose, but her voice carried a firmness that demanded attention. She explained why they were there, to talk about a string of property consultants who had been knocking on doors, targeting elderly homeowners, and leaving confusion in their wake. Some had already signed papers they barely understood. Others, like Mr. Wong, had felt the pressure mounting but had hesitated long enough to wonder whether something was wrong. One by one, people raised their hands to speak. An older man in a worn cap shuffled forward, his voice trembling as he recounted how a salesman had promised him a senior housing benefit package. The papers looked official, stamped with logos that resembled government seals, but after signing he discovered he had unknowingly transferred partial ownership of his house. It was only his daughter's intervention that stopped the process before it finalized. Murmurs spread to the crowd, heads nodding with recognition. A widow named Mrs. Lee spoke next, her tone sharp with anger. She described how two men in suits had arrived at her home on the same afternoon, insisting they represented a city program to help protect against foreclosure. They spoke so quickly, overwhelming her with jargon, that she felt she had no choice but to agree to an appointment. Later she realized they had been fishing for financial details, pressing her for account numbers and mortgage records under the guise of assistance. "They make you feel foolish if you question them," she said, her voice breaking, "as if you're the only one who doesn't understand what's happening." Mr. Wong listened carefully, the words cutting through him with uncomfortable clarity. Each story mirrored parts of his own encounter. The authoritative tone, the mention of city seizure, the insistence on urgency. These were not isolated incidents. They were threads in a larger pattern, woven by hands that knew exactly where to tug at the fabric of fear. Another man, younger than most in the room but still graying at the edges, explained that he had worked briefly for one of these property solution firms. His testimony darkened the room. He admitted that salesmen were trained to target neighborhoods with high retiree populations, using script designed to sound official and intimidating. They were given databases of addresses and instructed to return again and again until a resident either signed or broke down under pressure. "It's not just one company," he said grimly. "There are several, and they're all connected. Different names, same network." The revelation drew gasps, the sound of betrayal settling heavy among those who had already suspected but not known. Mrs. Chung leaned on the microphone again, her voice steady as she urged caution. She explained that these were organized operations, not random chance encounters. The same logos, the same fine print, the same rehearsed stories. They were all evidence of a coordinated effort. She reminded everyone that shame only helped the predators, keeping victims silent and scattered. Mr. Wong felt his face grow warm as he realized how close he had come to being one more story shared under fluorescent lights. He thought of the salesman's smile, the tap of his pen against the contract, the quiet certainty in his voice. It had all been part of script, one practiced countless times on countless others. The thought made his chest tighten, but it also filled him with something else, a cautious sense of resolve. The meeting ended with quiet determination. Lists of phone numbers were exchanged. Volunteers stepped forward to help review suspicious documents, and Mrs. Chung promised to arrange for a lawyer to speak at the next gathering. Neighbors who had walked past one another for years without more than a nod now lingered in small groups, comparing notes, offering reassurances. The vulnerability that kept them silent had been replaced, at least for the moment, with a shared awareness that they were not alone. As Mr. Wong left the cultural center and stepped into the cool night air, he paused on the sidewalk, looking back at the glowing windows. Inside, he had seen not only fear but also unity, the beginnings of something stronger than the tricks of suited men with practiced smiles. He adjusted his jacket, feeling the weight of the papers still sitting on his kitchen table at home, and realized they no longer seemed as inevitable as they once had. The salesman had not singled him out. He was part of a wider hunt. And now, finally, he was beginning to see the hunters clearly. The chairs were being stacked along the walls when Daniel first approached Mr. Wong. The young man had been sitting quietly in the second row through the entire meeting, his notebook balanced on his knees, jotting notes with the quick, practiced strokes of someone used to absorbing information. He looked out of place among the retirees. His black hair still thick, his frame wiry with youth, his clothes simple but neat. Mr. Wong noticed him at one point, thinking he might be someone's grandson dragged along reluctantly, but when the room began to empty, the young man moved with purpose, weaving through the crowd until he reached him. "Sir," Daniel said politely, his tone calm and measured, "may I ask if you have any of the documents that man gave you?" He hesitated, as if not wanting to overstep, then added, "I'm studying law. Contract law, actually." I couldn't help but notice the pattern in what everyone was describing tonight. Mr. Wong blinked, unsure how to respond. The papers were still at home, folded neatly on the kitchen table, their edges crisp where he had resisted creasing them in frustration. He had not yet confessed to anyone besides May that he had let the salesman sit in his living room, let him spread the contracts out as though they were routine. But something in Daniel's demeanor, the steady gaze, the quiet certainty, softened the edge of embarrassment. "I have them," he said slowly. "At home." Daniel nodded once, not pushing, not prying. "If you'd like, I can take a look." "No charge, of course. I've been volunteering here with Mrs. Chung, helping to review documents for some of the seniors who've been tricked. These scams use legal loopholes, but they're all built the same way. Once you know what to look for, the tricks stand out immediately." The words landed like a small relief, though Mr. Wong felt the heat of shame rise in his cheeks. He agreed, and later that evening, Daniel followed him down the quiet block to his modest home. Inside, the kitchen carried the faint scent of tea leaves and the lingering fragrance of ginger that May had left behind earlier. The papers sat exactly where the salesman had placed them, stacked neatly with a pen still resting across the top page. Daniel pulled out a chair, slid the stack toward himself, and began reading. His brow furrowed almost immediately. His finger traced down a paragraph, then another, his lips moving slightly as he parsed the jargon. He worked quickly but with precision, flipping pages back and forth, cross-referencing sections, as though he were piecing together a puzzle. After only a few minutes, he set the pen aside and looked up. "This isn't a maintenance agreement," he said firmly. "This is a transfer of interest. Right here." He tapped the fine print, a single sentence buried in a thicket of clauses. "By signing this, you'd be giving partial ownership of your property to their company. Once that's recorded, they could legally force you into a buyout or pressure you into selling the rest. It's dressed up in confusing terms, but the outcome is clear. They're trying to strip you of your home." Mr. Wong's chest tightened, though the confirmation was strangely clarifying. He had suspected, but hearing it spoken plainly erased the last trace of doubt. Daniel continued, pointing to another clause. "And here, they've slipped in a consent form for arbitration. That means if you tried to fight them later, you'd be locked into private arbitration instead of court. No judge, no jury, just a panel they likely control. It's designed so you can't win." He flipped another page, his finger landing on yet another line. "And this gives them access to your property records, bank information, even your utility bills. There's no reason they'd need this unless they were preparing to leverage pressure in multiple ways." The more Daniel explained, the colder the words felt in the room. Mr. Wong sat very still, his hands folded tightly on the table, as if bracing himself against the tide. He thought of the salesman's smile, the friendly pat on his shoulder, the way he had lowered his voice when speaking of city seizures. It had all been designed to lead him here, to these pages, to this trap. "Sir," Daniel said gently, "you're not the only one. These documents are nearly identical to ones I've seen from 3 other people this month. They changed the company name, the logo, but the skeleton is the same. This is organized, systematic. They're counting on confusion and silence to get away with it." Mr. Wong exhaled slowly, his eyes fixed on the neat rows of text that had nearly undone decades of sacrifice. Shame flickered across his features, but Daniel leaned forward, his voice firm but kind. You didn't do anything wrong. They are trained to make this convincing. Even lawyers sometimes miss the tricks on first glance. What matters is that you didn't sign. For the first time in weeks, Mr. Wong felt the tension in his chest ease. The house still stood under his name. The sacrifices of the factory floor, the careful savings, the nights spent worrying over mortgage payments, all of it had not been erased with a single pen stroke. Daniel stacked the papers neatly again and slid them back across the table. Keep these safe, he said, and let's bring copies to the next meeting. The more we compare, the clearer the picture becomes. Together, we can build a case strong enough to shut them down. Mr. Wong nodded, his gratitude quiet but profound. In this unexpected volunteer, this young man who had taken the time to read what others would dismiss, he saw a thread of protection, perhaps even hope. For the first time since the salesman had appeared at his door, he felt less alone, less vulnerable. The trap had been revealed, and with it, a path forward. Daniel stayed long after the neighborhood had grown quiet. The hum of streetlights outside seeping through the blinds as he spread the pages wider across Mr. Wong's kitchen table. His expression had sharpened, no longer the polite young volunteer who had approached hesitantly at the cultural center, but a careful investigator, steady and deliberate. Mr. Wong sat opposite him, shoulders slightly hunched, the faint tremor of his hand noticeable when he lifted his teacup. May had joined them too, arms crossed tightly, her eyes scanning the documents with an intensity that mirrored both anger and fear. The salesman's friendly patter had been left behind with the glossy brochures, but the ink on these papers carried an entirely different weight, one of entrapment, carefully crafted to disguise itself as help. Let me show you exactly how this works, Daniel said quietly. He tapped at the first page, his finger landing on a section dense with phrases like equitable consideration and conditional interest. Right here, see this line? It looks harmless, but what it really means is you be transferring a share of your deed into their company's name. That's the first step. Once your name is no longer the sole owner on record, they can use that foothold to pressure you out. It's not written as a sale. It's called a transfer of interest, which sounds minor, but it gives them legal standing over your house. Mr. Wong leaned closer, the words swimming in his vision. He had read them before, but they had been slippery, their meanings buried in jargon. Hearing them untangled was like seeing shadows shift into human shapes. Daniel flipped to another section, his voice steady but grim. This clause here, power of attorney, it's buried beneath paragraphs about property tax assistance. What it's really saying is that by signing, you're giving them permission to act on your behalf. That means they can make financial decisions, file documents with the county, even initiate transfers without needing your direct consent. You'd still be living here, still paying the bills, but legally, you'd be reduced to a guest in your own home. May's hands tightened on the edge of the table. That's theft, she said sharply. It's not even disguised well. How can this be allowed? It's legal because it's voluntary, Daniel explained. They rely on people not reading closely or feeling too intimidated to question. Once you sign, courts will assume you understood and agreed. That's why these scams target seniors. They're betting on trust, politeness, and fear. He turned to a later page. With a font shrank further, clauses strung together in a maze of contingencies and remedies. He underlined one line with his pen. This is a foreclosure trap. Notice how it's written as a clause for assistance in the event of financial hardship. It says that if you fall behind on taxes or repairs, their company will step in to relieve you of burdensome obligations. It sounds like help, but what it means is they can foreclose on your home under the guise of rescue. You'd lose everything and it would be legal. Mr. Wong sat very still, the enormity of it pressing down like a weight on his chest. His mind traveled back to the salesman's rehearsed concern, the way he had lowered his voice when warning about the city taking homes, the reassuring tone that had wrapped every phrase like a blanket. All of it had been stagecraft, crafted to usher him toward this moment, toward handing away what his entire life had been built around. Daniel continued carefully, unfolding the picture piece by piece. This is not one man. The language here is too polished, too standardized. These contracts are likely written by a legal team and passed down to salesmen who work neighborhood by neighborhood. They call themselves property consultants or tax relief agents, but it's all the same structure. They feed on fear of rising costs, on confusion about city policies, and they use it to funnel ownership into their own portfolios. May's face was pale but resolute. So if my father had signed, they'd already be filing the paperwork at the county clerk's office, Daniel finished. You'd find out when it was too late. Silence hung over the table for a long moment, broken only by the faint ticking of the wall clock. Mr. Wong's hands rested on the wood, palms flat, as if grounding himself. He thought of the factory floors, the late nights spent working overtime, the coins saved in jars that had once filled the kitchen counter. Each penny had led to this house, this refuge, this roof under which his children had grown. And with one signature, it might have all dissolved, leaving him a stranger in his own living room. May reached across the table, laying her hand over his. "We're not going to let them get away with this," she said softly but with an edge of determination. "Not with you, not with anyone else." Daniel nodded, gathering the papers back into a neat stack. "The good news is you didn't sign, and now we have evidence. These documents can be copied and compared with what others have been given. If we show the pattern, it becomes harder for them to deny intent. With enough voices, enough proof, we can expose this network for what it is." The kitchen felt different now, less like a place of looming threat, and more like a small war room. The salesman's shadow still lingered, but it had been pierced by light, by the clarity of explanation, by the recognition of the trap. For the first time, Mr. Wong felt the scale of what he faced, but also the presence of allies at his side. The house still stood, intact, and with it, the history and dignity he had nearly signed away. Mr. Wong sat alone in the living room long after May and Daniel had gone, the soft creak of the old house filling the silence between his thoughts. The papers still lay on the table where they had been spread out, neat again but no less menacing, a stack that seemed heavier than their actual weight. He had listened, nodded, even thanked Daniel for his help. But once the door had closed behind them, the house had settled back into its familiar quiet. The unease returned in waves. Shame burned at the edges of his thoughts, sharper than fear, because he could not escape the reality that he had been drawn so close to signing away everything he had built. The salesman's smile replayed in his mind, the gentle way he had explained each page, his voice confident but warm. Mr. Wong had believed him, or at least wanted to believe him, because it was easier to accept the offer of guidance than to admit he no longer understood the world moving around him. Property taxes, government regulations, assistance programs. It all seemed to blur into a maze of rules that shifted faster than he could keep track. He told himself that the man had sounded professional, that he had presented identification, that there had been nothing in his manner to raise alarm. But underneath those justifications lurked a harder truth. He had been vulnerable, and someone had seen it. The weight of that realization pressed against his pride. For decades, he had been the one others leaned on. In the factory, younger workers had watched how he moved, how he saved, how he stretched every dollar. At home, he had been the steady figure, the one who handled bills and repairs, the one his children had looked to for answers. Even after his wife's passing, he had told himself he could still manage, that independence was not something to be surrendered lightly. Yet here he was, almost tricked into handing away the very home that represented those years of sacrifice. His thoughts spiraled into the past, to his own father's warnings about slick talkers who preyed on trust. Back then, the tricks had been different. Phony lotteries, false job offers, but the essence had been the same. His father had told him to always be cautious, to never let pride blind him to danger. And now, in the quiet of his own home, Mr. Wong felt the sting of having forgotten those lessons, or perhaps of believing they no longer applied to him. Age had made him cautious in some ways, but it also made him tired, willing to accept an easy path if it promised relief. That tiredness, he realized, could have cost him everything. What unsettled him most was the feeling of weakness. Not just physical weakness, the ache in his knees when he bent to tie his shoes, the slower steps he took each morning, but the weakness of doubt, the erosion of certainty. He wondered if May had seen it in him. The way his voice wavered when Daniel explained the fine print. The way he stared at the table instead of meeting her eyes. She had always been respectful, but tonight there had been something different in her expression. Concern mixed with quiet judgment, as if she were beginning to see him not as the father who had once stood unshaken, but as an old man losing his footing. The thought made his chest tighten. He did not want to be a burden, did not want to become another responsibility for May, who already worked long hours and carried her own family's weight. If he admitted how close he had come to signing, if he confessed the depth of his confusion, would she begin to treat him differently? Would she start suggesting things he dreaded? Assisted living, guardianship, the quiet surrender control? The doubts circled until he could barely breathe through them. He folded his hands together, staring at the calluses still faintly visible on his palms, relics of decades spent at the factory machines. Those hands had built his life, had built this home, and yet with a single careless moment they had nearly betrayed him. That contradiction gnawed at him, strength fading into vulnerability, pride giving way to embarrassment. The night grew late, but sleep would not come. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the salesman's pen hovering over the signature line, his own name poised to give away a lifetime. He imagined neighbors shaking their heads as they learned what had happened. Imagined whispers that he'd been foolish, careless, naive. Worse still, he imagined his wife's voice, the way she used to remind him that everything they worked for was for the children, for the future. To nearly lose it now, in his twilight years, felt like a betrayal not just of himself, but of her memory. So he sat in silence, torn between gratitude that May and Daniel had intervened and humiliation that he had needed them to. The papers on the table remained, their edges sharp in the dim light, a constant reminder how close he had come. He told himself that tomorrow he would be stronger, that he would not let shame dictate his choices. Yet tonight, the doubt lingered, heavy and unrelenting, reminding him that the hardest part growing old was not the slowing body, but the quiet erosion of certainty. The sun had already slipped low behind the rooftops when May stepped out of her father's front door, her arms folded tight against her chest, not from the chill but from the rising heat of her own anger. The salesman was still there, standing beside his glossy black car parked neatly at the curb. He leaned casually against the door as if he owned the street, his briefcase balanced on the hood, the same easy smile still fixed across his face. To a passerby, he looked harmless, professional even, but May had read the papers he left behind, had seen through the glossy language and fine print. She marched toward him without hesitation, her footsteps loud on the cracked pavement. He straightened at once, adjusting his cufflinks with a smooth flick of his fingers, as though preparing for a performance. "Miss Wong," he said with a nod, his voice honeyed and calm. "You look upset. Perhaps your father didn't explain things fully. These agreements are designed to help families like yours. No need for hostility." May's jaw tightened. "Help?" she repeated, her voice steady but cold. "You call stripping an old man of his home help?" You sat in his living room, smiled in his face, and tried to trick him into signing away everything he worked for. You think because he's polite, because he's old, you can just walk in here and take advantage? The smile faltered, but only for a moment. He tilted his head slightly, the polished charm bending into something sharper. "You misunderstand," he said, his tone measured now. "Property tax laws are complicated, full of loopholes most retirees cannot navigate. I offer solutions, protection. Without me, people like your father could lose everything to the city. Do you want that on your conscience?" May stepped closer, refusing to back down. "What I want is for you to leave and never come back. If you show your face here again, I'll make sure every neighbor knows your name. And believe me, they'll talk. This community still looks out for each other." At that, his expression shifted further, the mask slipping enough to show the steel beneath the charm. His smile thinned into a line. His words dipped in threat, though coated with courtesy. "Careful," he said softly. "Accusations can be dangerous. I have lawyers, connections. If you go around spreading lies, there will be consequences. Perhaps not for you directly, but for your father. A man in his position could find himself tangled in audits, late fees, penalties. Red tape can strangle if you don't know how to cut through it." May froze for just a second, stunned by the casual cruelty tucked into his words. She had expected him to bluff or deny, but not to turn so quickly to veiled intimidation. Still, she steadied her voice. "That sounded a lot like a threat," she said, eyes fixed on his. "You think you can scare me with legal jargon and empty promises? You picked the wrong house. My father may be polite, but I am not afraid of you." The salesman's smile returned, thinner now, edged like a blade. "Fear has nothing to do with it," he said, straightening his jacket. "This is business. And in business, those who hesitate lose. Your father hesitated. Others will not. Remember that." He snapped his briefcase shut with a click that echoed in the quiet street. May's heart pounded, but she stood her ground as he slipped into his car, the engine humming to life. Before pulling away, he lowered the window, leaning slightly toward her. "Families like yours always think sentiment will save them," he said in a low voice, almost drowned out by the rumble of the car. "But sentiment is weakness. Sooner or later, someone collects the debt." Then, with a faint smirk, he rolled the window up and drove off, the tires crunching over loose gravel. The street fell silent again, but the echo of his words lingered in May's ears like smoke that refused to clear. She stood there a moment longer, fists clenched at her sides, watching the red glow of his taillights fade into the distance. Every instinct told her he was not finished, that this was not the end of his schemes, only a pause. But she also knew he had underestimated her resolve. He had come expecting silence, deference, the easy compliance of an old man. Instead, he had met resistance, and resistance had a way of spreading. When she finally turned back toward the house, she caught sight of the curtains shifting slightly. Her father watching from the window. His face was etched with worry, but there was also something else, something like pride. May took a deep breath, willing herself to be steady for his sake. The battle was far from over, but she had made one thing clear. Mr. Wong would not be alone in this fight, and no salesman, no matter how polished his charm or veiled his threats, would take that away. Daniel sat hunched over the dimly lit desk in the community center's back office, the glow of his laptop casting sharp shadows across the stacks of outdated newsletters and donated books piled against the wall. He had told Mr. Wong in May he would look into the company, a promise he made with calm confidence. But now, deep into the night, the weight of what he was uncovering was settling onto his shoulders. His fingers moved steadily across the keyboard, searching public records, cross-referencing addresses, sifting through dry filings that seemed designed to bore the reader into giving up. Yet buried in the monotony, a pattern was beginning to emerge, threads weaving together into something more sinister. The company name that appeared on the contract, Heritage Property Solutions, was not as solid as the salesman made it sound. It had only been incorporated 3 years earlier, registered to a P.O. box in another city. Daniel traced the address through state databases, only to find it linked to half a dozen other companies with different names but strikingly similar missions. Senior Property Assistance, Retirement Asset Services, Golden Years Housing Protection. Each one folded quietly after a string of complaints, only to reappear under a new name. Daniel leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He could almost hear the salesman's voice, smooth and polished, insisting this was all routine. But the documents told another story. He clicked through court databases, one slow search after another, until lawsuits began to appear. They weren't splashed across headlines or pinned to the first page of results. Instead, they lay buried in county archives, dull PDFs with case numbers stretching back years. Families alleging fraud, elderly homeowners stripped of their titles, plaintiffs describing intimidation, falsified deadlines, contracts so dense with legal traps that even experienced attorneys took time to parse them. The deeper he looked, the more the picture sharpened. Dozens of cases filed across different counties, always against the same few men, always dismissed or quietly settled before trial. Daniel scrolled through scanned affidavits, testimonies typed in stilted language, where widows described being pressured late at night, pensioners recalling threats disguised as friendly advice. In one particularly chilling case, an elderly couple lost their home within months of signing what they thought was a simple maintenance agreement. They had nowhere to go, and the case ended in a quiet settlement that sealed the records from public access. Daniel's pulse quickened as he pieced it together. This wasn't one salesman acting alone. It was a network, a rotating shell of companies designed to move just ahead of detection, to exhaust the energy of those who dared to resist. Heritage Property Solutions was only the latest mask. He opened a file from a watchdog nonprofit that had tried to map such predatory practices, noting the same attorney's name appearing repeatedly in different court filings, defending each company. The lawyer specialized in draining cases until the victims, often elderly and overwhelmed, simply gave up. As he compiled the documents into a single folder, Daniel's thoughts drifted back to Mr. Wong. He pictured the man's quiet dignity, the way his hands trembled when he folded the papers, the shame he felt at being drawn in by a smiling face at his door. It was infuriating to think that there were likely dozens, maybe hundreds, just like him, silent casualties whose homes and security had been siphoned away without the world noticing. The clock on the wall ticked toward midnight, the building around him silent. Daniel copied the files onto a flash drive, labeling plainly, Heritage Scam Evidence. He knew this wasn't enough to bring company down, not yet, but it was a start. Patterns mattered. Paper trails mattered. And once a story like this reached the right ears, silence could no longer protect the guilty. He saved one last document. A particularly damning case from 2 years earlier in which a retired teacher had accused the company of altering sign pages after fact. The handwriting analysis suggested forgery, but the case had been settled before it could reach a jury. Daniel stared at the closing statement, the teacher's signature fading at the bottom of the scan page, and felt a chill. These weren't accidents or misunderstandings. They were calculated moves. Closing his laptop, Daniel sat still for a long moment, the flash drive heavy in his palm. Outside, the streetlights flickered over empty sidewalks, but he knew that somewhere, that same salesman was already knocking on another door, smiling the same rehearsed smile, waiting for another quiet retiree to open it. For the first time, Daniel realized the fight wasn't just about Mr. Wong's house. It was about exposing an entire network built on preying upon the vulnerable. And now, with a hidden file pulled into the light, the question wasn't whether they could prove it, but how much time they had before the salesman realized someone had finally traced his trail. At first, it was only whispers, passed between hedges or murmured over grocery carts in the market. A few neighbors had seen the sharply dressed man lingering on their porches, his clipboard tucked under his arm, his smile as polished as his shoes. Others admitted reluctantly that they had taken his flyers, pale sheets promising security, protection, relief from burdens too heavy for aging shoulders. One neighbor mentioned a letter she received, official-looking with an embossed seal, warning that property taxes could force her out unless she enrolled in a stability program. Another quietly confessed that she, too, had signed something, though she refused to say exactly what. Each voice was cautious, burdened by the fear of embarrassment. But together they began to weave a picture larger than any one of them had dared imagine. Word spread that Daniel and May were digging into the matter, and soon, retirees who once kept to themselves found reasons to knock on the Wong's front door or slip folded papers into May's hands when she came home from work. They brought envelopes with return addresses that led nowhere, contracts worded in dense legal jargon, and notices bearing deadlines that seemed impossibly close. Some bore the same company name, Heritage Property Solutions. Others carried different titles but used identical phrasing, the same predatory cadence disguised as assistance. Daniel spread the documents across Mr. Wong's kitchen table until the wood grain disappeared beneath layers of evidence. The neighbors gathered there, too, their voices overlapping, their faces tense. Mrs. Chan from 2 doors down clutched her stack of letters with trembling hands, saying she had thought they were from the city. Mr. Patel, who lived at the corner, admitted that he nearly mailed a check to cover a processing fee before his grandson intervened. A widow from across the street recalled the salesman's visit, how he leaned against her doorway and spoke as though he were doing her a favor by offering his plan. Listening to them, it became impossible to believe this was coincidence. The scale of it settled heavily over the room, an invisible storm cloud. Mr. Wong sat quietly through most of it, his brow furrowed, his gaze fixed on the table. Every new testimony seemed to tighten the knot of shame in his chest. Yet there was a grim solidarity in knowing he was not alone. The deception that had reached his doorstep had also touched others. It wasn't his failing. It was a calculated scheme designed to target them all. The realization shifted something in the air. Less fear, more resolve. Daniel took notes, compiling dates, names, and descriptions. He explained how the repetition across documents proved coordination. They recycled the same threats, he said, tapping one letter where the wording about property seizure was nearly identical to another. They count on people not talking to each other, not comparing. His tone carried a steadying weight, and even those most shaken began to feel the edge of anger sharpening beneath their unease. By the time the gathering stretched into evening, the small house was crowded with voices, some strained, others fierce. Neighbors who had barely exchanged greetings in years now leaned close, finding courage in shared outrage. A man who had lived quietly since his wife passed declared that he was ready to speak to the press if it would help. Another offered to drive anyone who needed to file complaints at the city office. May listened intently, her jaw tight, her eyes flashing with a determination that mirrored her father's younger self in ways she had never noticed before. The salesman had come thinking he was targeting isolated retirees, each alone behind their doors, each ashamed to ask for help. But in trying to manipulate one, he had inadvertently awakened a community. The papers on the table were no longer just contracts and letters. They had become symbols of resistance. What once felt like private humiliation was now revealed as collective injury, and in that recognition lay strength. As night fell, neighbors carried their documents home again, but the promise lingered that they would meet once more, better prepared. Mr. Wong walked them out to the porch, his modest frame silhouetted in the glow of the porch light. For the first time in months, he felt the house less like a solitary burden, and more like a gathering point, a place where a defense was forming. The storm was indeed gathering, not just in the legal papers Daniel unearthed, but in the quiet voices that had found one another. The salesman had underestimated them, mistaking aid for weakness, mistaking politeness for surrender. Now, as the door shut and the house fell back into silence, the neighborhood stood on the edge of something different. Not defeat, but the beginning of a fight. It was late afternoon when the knock came, sharp and insistent against the wood of Mr. Wong's door. The sun had begun its descent, casting the quiet street in a golden haze that made the shadows seem longer, heavier. Mr. Wong rose from his chair with a weary stiffness, his hand brushing the papers still spread on the dining table. Evidence of everything Daniel and May had been uncovering. He moved slowly to the door, half expecting to see May with her determined eyes or Daniel with his patient explanations. Instead, when he opened it, the familiar polished smile of the salesman greeted him, brighter than the late sunlight. Beside him stood another man, younger, bulkier, dressed in the same slick manner, but with harder eyes that scanned the house like it already belonged to them. The salesman launched immediately into his performance, as though he had rehearsed every gesture. His voice carried the practiced warmth of someone who made a living stepping into people's homes and leaving with their trust. "Mr. Wong," he said, his tone dripping with rehearsed familiarity. "I was just in the neighborhood and wanted to stop by. I brought a colleague today, so we can help you finalize those agreements. You'll feel much better once everything is settled." He held out a folder, thick with contracts, the edges crisp and deliberate, as if the papers themselves demanded compliance. Mr. Wong hesitated, his hand tightening on the doorknob. He could feel the weight of May's warning in his mind, hear Daniel's clear voice explaining what those hidden clauses meant. Yet there they stood, two figures on his doorstep, speaking with the casual authority of men who expected no resistance. The younger associate stepped forward slightly, not enough to breach the threshold, but close enough to make his presence unmistakable. His eyes fixed on Wong, his smile faint but laced with something unkind, as if reminding him that politeness could only be stretched so far. The salesman kept talking, layering his words with urgency. He spoke of deadlines, of city inspectors scheduled to review properties, of forms that needed signatures to avoid complications. Each phrase was a carefully balanced mixture of fear and reassurance, the same blend that had ensnared so many others on the block. He gestured casually toward the folder, as though it were no more than routine maintenance paperwork, but each motion carried the weight of a trap closing in. Inside, Mr. Wong's heart pounded. He thought of the decades spent in factories, saving coins in jars, folding bills into envelopes until he had enough to buy this house. He thought of his wife's laughter in the kitchen, The birthdays celebrated in the living room. The mornings he rose early just to tend the garden she had loved. And now, these men stood on his porch as if it were theirs to claim. A flush of shame crept over him. The same embarrassment that had silenced before, but beneath it stirred something else, an ember of defiance, faint but present. He cleared his throat and said, "My daughter looks over all my papers. I don't sign anything without her." It was a simple sentence, spoken quietly, but it cut through the salesman's performance. For the first time, the salesman's smile faltered just for a second before reasserting itself. The younger man shifted, crossing his arms, his posture hardening. "That won't be necessary," the salesman replied smoothly, though there was an edge beneath the silk. "These are standard documents. Very straightforward. No need to trouble your daughter with the details. She's busy, isn't she? You wouldn't want to burden her." The word struck like a needle, playing directly into the guilt Mr. Wong had carried for years. He opened his mouth, unsure what to say, but at that moment, May's car pulled into the driveway. The sound of the engine and the crunch of tires on gravel cut through the charged silence. The salesman's eyes flicked toward the car, and the younger man's jaw tightened. May stepped out quickly, her gaze locking on the two men before shifting to her father. She could read the scene instantly, the contract in the folder, the tension in her father's shoulders. "Dad," she called firmly, walking up the path. "We talked about this. You're not signing anything without me or Daniel." Her voice carried no hesitation, only steel. The salesman's charm thinned into something brittle. He tried to maintain his composure, but the presence of May, unyielding and protective, made it harder for him to maintain his carefully crafted performance. The associate glanced at him, waiting for a cue, but for once, no slick words came easily. The air between them grew taut. Mr. Wong stood caught between the weight of old habits, deference, politeness, fear of confrontation, and the undeniable relief that his daughter was now at his side. He looked at the salesman's polished smile, at the folder of papers that promised ruin disguised as security, and for the first time, he did not feel invisible. He simply stepped back and said, "I think it's time for you to leave." The silence that followed was sharper than the salesman's words. His smile lingered, but his eyes betrayed irritation, the mask slipping to reveal the calculation beneath. He closed the folder with deliberate calm, nodded curtly, and turned toward the street with his associate at his side. As they walked away, May slipped her arm around her father, guiding him back inside. The papers had not been signed, but the battle was far from over. The knock at the door had been a warning. This fight was no longer confined to whispers and suspicions. The salesman had returned, and he would not give up easily. The night was unusually quiet, the kind of stillness that made every creak of the house feel amplified. Mr. Wong sat alone in the living room after May had gone home, the lamplight casting a muted glow across the walls that bore photographs of another life. His eyes wandered from picture to picture. His wife's smile frozen in a wedding portrait, their children when they were small, summer spent in the backyard before the years dulled the colors of memory. The visit from the salesman had left a restless energy in him, a sense that something unresolved was pressing at the edges of his thoughts. He rose from his chair with deliberate slowness and walked toward the back room, a place he rarely entered anymore. The room still smelled faintly of her, lavender sachets tucked into drawers, the lingering sweetness of her perfume that no time could entirely erase. Against the far wall stood an old oak dresser, its drawers worn from decades of use. At the very bottom, behind stacks of blankets, was a locked drawer. Mr. Wong knelt down, his knees protesting, and reached for the small brass key he kept hidden in a tin box on the shelf. His hands trembled slightly as he turned the lock, and when the drawer slid open, it revealed a wooden box with his late wife's initials carved into the lid. For years he had avoided opening it, not because he had forgotten what lay inside, but because facing it felt like stepping into a conversation with her he wasn't ready to have. Tonight, with the salesman's voice still echoing in his mind and May's warnings pressing at his conscience, he knew it was time. He lifted the box and carried it carefully to the table, setting it down as though it were fragile glass. When he opened it, the scent of old paper and cedar filled the air. Inside were neatly bundled envelopes, a stack of government savings bonds tied with string, and a collection of letters in his wife's handwriting. He touched the bonds first, their edges crisp despite the years. She had bought them steadily, quietly, saving from her sewing work, telling him at the time that they were just in case. He remembered teasing her about being too cautious, but she had only smiled and said that one day they would be glad. Now, looking at them, he felt a pang of gratitude mixed with sorrow. These bonds were more than money. They were proof of her foresight, her determination to safeguard their home and family even in her absence. Beneath the bonds lay the letters. His fingers shook as he unfolded the first one. The ink slightly faded, but her handwriting unmistakable. She had written them over the years. Some meant for him, others for May and their son, reminders and messages of love she wanted to leave behind. One line in particular caught his eye, written with the firm clarity of someone who knew exactly what mattered. Asterisk, this house is our anchor. Promise me it will always stay in the family. Asterisk, he read the words again and again, feeling them settle deep into him like a vow renewed. Another letter was more personal, addressed to him directly. She spoke of the years they had endured together, the sacrifices of long shifts and careful budgeting, the countless small choices that had built a life brick by brick. We did not work for strangers to take what we built, she had written. This place carries us, even when we are gone. Protect it, and it will protect those who come after. The words struck him with such force that he had to set the paper down, his vision blurred with tears he had not expected. He sat there for a long while, the letters spread before him. The savings bonds a tangible reminder of her quiet strength. The shame that had weighed on him for nearly falling into the salesman's trap felt sharper now, but alongside it came resolve. He could not let her down, not after all they had endured together. She had seen a future where this house would outlast them both, sheltering their children, their grandchildren. To lose it because of a signature coerced by lies would be a betrayal he could not carry. As the night deepened, Mr. Wong carefully placed the letters back in the box, smoothing them with reverence. He locked the bonds and papers away again, returning the key to its hiding place. Yet something within him had shifted. The salesman's threats no longer felt like an inescapable trap. There were obstacles he could face, armed now not just with the warnings of his daughter and the guidance of Daniel, but with the enduring voice of his wife. Her words lingered in the quiet, steady and unyielding. The house must stay in the family, and for the first time in days, he felt certain that it would. The morning light filtered weakly through the thin curtains of the dining room, turning the old oak table into a stage where paper, ink, and memory came together. Mr. Wong sat with his daughter, May, who had been quietly urging him for days to look through the box of letters left behind by her mother. He had resisted at first, ashamed of how close he had come to signing away the house, afraid of what truths might surface when her voice returned through ink and paper. But now the box lay open between them, and May had pulled out one letter carefully, her fingers brushing the edges as though the paper itself might bruise. She unfolded it slowly, the creases worn from years of being folded tight. Her eyes scanned the handwriting, neat and steady, a hand that had once written shopping lists, recipes, and reminders now preserved as testimony. May cleared her throat, her voice trembling with a mixture of reverence and sorrow as she began to read aloud. "My dear husband," she started, her mother's words flowing into the room as though she were speaking again after years of silence. "If you are reading this, it means I can no longer sit across from you at this very table, watching the steam rise from your tea. It means time has moved forward, even though I wish I could have stayed beside you longer. But I want you to remember, no matter what comes, this home is our life's work. It is a proof of every sacrifice, every late shift, every coin we saved when it would have been easier to spend. Do not let it slip into the hands of those who never bled for it." May's voice cracked slightly as she continued, glancing at her father who sat rigid in his chair, his eyes fixed on the table. She pressed on, her tone steadier now. "I know the world will change after I am gone. There will be smooth talkers who come with smiles and promises. There will be papers that seem harmless but are traps. There will be whispers that perhaps you are too old to hold on, too tired to fight. I am asking you to resist. This house must never be given away out of fear. It must stay in our family, even if it means asking for help. Pride should not cost us everything. The room was so quiet that the ticking of the clock on the wall sounded louder than usual. May's words carried both her own grief and her mother's strength, weaving them together into something her father could no longer ignore. She continued, her eyes softening as she read the closing lines. This home is where our children took their first steps. It is where we endured winters with broken heating and summers when a roof leaked, but we never surrendered it. It holds us together even when life tries to scatter us apart. If you ever feel doubt, remember me here, sitting across from you, telling you that we built this place to last. Promise me, my love, that you will not let anyone take it away. When May lowered the letter, the silence that followed was heavier than before, filled with the weight of a presence that felt almost physical. Mr. Wong's hands gripped the edges of the table, his knuckles pale, his eyes wet but unblinking. He had heard his wife's voice so clearly in those words that it was as if she had returned, scolding him gently but firmly, reminding him of who he was and what they had built. May reached across the table, placing her hand over his. She knew, she whispered. She knew this might happen one day. She wanted you to remember you're not alone in this. For the first time in weeks, Mr. Wong did not look like a man cornered by his own fear. He looked instead like a man remembering his strength, guided by the voice of the woman who had stood beside him through every hardship. The shame of nearly being deceived lingered, but it was softened now by the knowledge that his wife had anticipated his struggles and left him a compass in her words. He nodded slowly, his grip tightening around May's hand. I promise, he said quietly, almost to himself, but May heard it clearly. His voice carried the resolve of someone reclaiming ground that had been slipping away. The salesman's threats, the contracts with their hidden traps, the doubt that gnawed at him, all of it seemed smaller, now compared to the letter that spoke from the past. As May folded the letter and placed it gently back into the box, she could see the change in her father. The fear was not gone, but it no longer ruled him. The house was no longer just four walls under threat. It was a vow carried forward, one he would fight to uphold. The voice of the past had become the shield of the present, and neither Mr. Wong nor May would allow it to be silenced. The police station smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper, a place where lives passed through in fragments, complaints, reports, fingerprints on file. Mr. Wong sat stiffly on the hard plastic chair, his cap held in his hands, eyes lowered as if he were a schoolboy summoned to explain a misstep. May sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, steadying him each time he looked as though he might rise and walk out. Daniel had driven them there, insisting that even if the system moved slowly, even if the outcome was uncertain, an official record had to exist. Without it, the salesman's shadow would only grow. The officer who finally called their number looked young, his uniform crisp, his posture formal in a way that suggested he was still getting used to the way of authority. He gestured toward a desk scattered with forms and a keyboard that clicked when he typed. "Please have a seat," he said. His tone was polite, but already there was that quiet undertone of routine, the sound of someone who had heard too many stories like this before. Daniel leaned forward, explaining clearly, with the precision of a law student who had already rehearsed the points in his mind. He laid out the sequence: the salesman's visits, the papers presented, the fabricated threats about property taxes, the pressure tactics. He spoke calmly but firmly, sliding copies of the documents across the desk, each page marked with sticky notes highlighting the troubling clauses. The officer's eyes scanned them, pausing the phrases that revealed intent. Transfer of deed, power of attorney. His brows furrowed slightly, though he did not interrupt. When Daniel finished, the officer exhaled and glanced at Mr. Wong. "Sir, do you confirm this is what happened?" he asked gently. Mr. Wong nodded slowly, his throat dry. His voice cracked when he finally answered. "Yes, he came to my home. He said the city would take it if I didn't sign. I thought maybe he was right." His words trailed off, and shame curled at the edges of his voice. May reached out, squeezing her father's hand, as if to remind him that admitting this was not weakness but courage. Daniel added, "Mr. Wong didn't sign. The papers are here. That's why we're here now, before it's too late." The officer tapped his pen against the desk, then began filling out the fields on the computer screen. We can file a preliminary report, he explained. This will put the incident on record. It doesn't guarantee prosecution, but it's the first step. His tone was careful, practiced, the kind that carried both sympathy and distance. What do you mean by doesn't guarantee? May asked, her voice sharper than she intended. The officer glanced at her, then back at the screen. These kinds of scams are hard to prosecute. Often the companies are shell corporations, dissolved and replaced before charges stick. Paper trails vanish. Witnesses disappear. By the time a case goes to court, the scammers have already moved on to another neighborhood. He paused, softening his tone. But if we have multiple reports, if we can establish a pattern, then the chances increase. One voice is easy to dismiss. 10 voices together are harder. Mr. Wong swallowed hard, the words settling heavily. He felt both smaller and larger at once. Just one man in a city of millions, yet now part of a record that might one day matter. Daniel leaned in, speaking with conviction. That's why this matters. Even if it feels small now, this is how we build a case. Others are out there, and if they file too, then this scammer won't keep slipping away. The officer finished typing, printed a form, and slid it across the desk. Read it over. Sign at the bottom if it looks accurate. This makes it official. Mr. Wong picked up the pen with a hand that trembled slightly. He hesitated, the weight of the act pressing on him. All his life, signing papers had been tied to sacrifice and responsibility. The mortgage, his children's school forms, retirement withdrawals. Now this signature was not about obligation, but about defiance. He signed slowly, each stroke deliberate, his name anchoring him to the decision. When it was done, the officer gathered the pages and stamped them. The sound of the stamp echoed faintly, sealing the moment in ink and record. We'll add this to the file, he said. If there are updates, you'll be contacted. In the meantime, be cautious. If he comes back, call us immediately. As they stood to leave, Mr. Wong's posture shifted. He was still weary, still burdened, but no longer passive. He had taken the first formal step against the shadow pressing at his door. Outside, the late afternoon sun slanted across the station steps, casting long shadows down the pavement. May slipped her arm through her father's, Daniel walking slightly ahead. And for the first time in weeks, the fear felt like something they were pushing back rather than letting in. The police report might not be a shield, but it was a beginning, a mark on the record that said Mr. Wong had refused to stay silent. The living room carried the faint smell of tea leaves steeped too long, a habit Elena never corrected. She had once presided over crowded courtrooms, her gavel calling for order above the noise of lawyers and witnesses, but now her days passed in quieter rhythms. Bookshelves lined with legal texts and old case files still loomed against her walls, reminders of decades spent parsing evidence and weighing testimony. When May knocked on her door with her father and Daniel standing just behind, Elena already sensed the weight they carried. She invited them in without ceremony, her voice low but steady, the kind of tone that once silenced entire rooms. They sat around a wooden table marked with rings from years of teacups. Mr. Wong's hands twisted his cap in silence, his eyes tracing the grain of the wood as if afraid to lift them. May explained everything again, this time not to a police officer or a neighbor, but to someone who had lived in the heart of the system. She spoke quickly, her words sharp, almost rushing to stay ahead of her own anger. The salesman, the contracts, the threats. It all spilled out. Daniel added his observations, setting the copies of the documents down as if they were exhibits prepared for a hearing. Elena listened without interruption. Her eyes narrowed as she studied the papers, her finger pausing on each predatory clause. The fine print did not surprise her. She had seen similar tactics over the years, just dressed in different language. When she finally spoke, her words carried both the weight of law and the blunt clarity of someone who no longer had to temper her truths for the record. This is fraud, she said. Carefully constructed, yes, but fraud nonetheless. He's not selling a service. He's trying to strip you of ownership under the guise of protection. Mr. Wong shifted uneasily, shame clinging to his posture. I should have known, he murmured, but Elena cut him off with a firm shake of her head. These schemes are designed to fool anyone, especially elders who trust the appearance of authority. Do not blame yourself for their deception. Blame them for preying on you. Her voice carried the tone of a ruling, as if she were still on the bench. She leaned back, folding her hands. The police report was the right start. But if you want this to stop, if you want protection for yourself and others, the next step is legal action. The law has provisions for cases exactly like this. Elder protection statutes, consumer fraud regulations, even injunctions that can freeze their operations if enough evidence is presented. But it requires courage to step into that arena. Daniel leaned forward, nodding. That's what I've been telling them. If we take this to court, we're not just defending one house. We're creating precedent that protects the entire neighborhood. Maybe more. Elena's gaze shifted toward him, measuring the young man with the quiet scrutiny of a judge weighing a witness. Then she looked back at Mr. Wong. You will not stand alone, she said. I may be retired, but I still know the channels. I know the judges who hear these cases, and I know how to frame the argument so it cannot be ignored. If you want to proceed, I'll guide you. For the first time that evening, Mr. Wong raised his eyes. They carried years of exhaustion, of battles fought in silence. He thought of the mortgage he had paid with sweat and overtime, the meals skipped so his children could eat, the nights he had stood at factory machines just to ensure this house would never be lost. Now the threat came not from hardship, but from deception. His voice trembled, but his words carried resolve. If it means protecting what my wife and I built, then yes, we proceed. Elena nodded once, a decisive motion that seemed to seal the commitment. She pulled a yellow notepad closer, her pen gliding across it in sharp, deliberate strokes. She outlined the steps, securing affidavit from neighbors, collecting copies of every fraudulent letter, preparing declarations that would withstand cross-examination. She spoke of elder protection statutes like an architect sketching the foundation of a fortress. The legal language sounded dense, but beneath it lay reassurance. There were laws meant to shield people like Mr. Wong, and she knew how to use them. May felt her chest loosen as she watched. For weeks, she had carried the fear that her father's trust had put him in danger. Now she saw something shift. The narrative was no longer when an old man tricked his doorstep, but a family and a community ready to push back. By the time they left, the night had deepened, the streetlights glowing softly against a quiet block. Mr. Wong held the folder of documents closer to his chest, not as a burden, but as evidence, as a shield slowly forming. Elena stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the warm light behind her. She was no longer a judge in title. Yet in that moment, she was once again the anchor between fear and justice, planting the first seeds of the case that would soon grow roots in the courtroom. The first call came late in the evening, just as Mr. Wong was settling into his worn armchair with a pot of tea that had grown bitter from oversteeping. The phone rang with a sharpness that startled him, and when he lifted the receiver, the salesman's voice poured through, no longer honeyed and warm, but clipped and biting. Gone was the charm that had once coated every sentence. Now each word was sharpened with contempt. Mr. Wong, the voice said, "You're making a mistake. Do you really want to gamble with your family's future? The city won't wait for you to change your mind." Before Wong could respond, the line went dead. He sat there for a moment, the silence of the house pressing in around him. His hand lingered on the receiver as though it were heavy, almost too much to place back in its cradle. In the past, he might have dismissed such threats as empty talk, but he could not deny the unease curling in his chest. The salesman knew his name, his address, his vulnerabilities. And now, knowing he had been refused, the mask had slipped. The next morning, May found notice stuffed through the mail slot. It looked official at first glance, stamped with seals that mimicked the city's housing department. The language was technical, citing fabricated codes and false penalties, warning of imminent foreclosure if immediate action was not taken. The paper bore no return address, no verifiable signatures, only the bold urgency of intimidation. When May showed it to Daniel, his jaw tightened. "This isn't from the city. It's a scare tactic. He's trying to make you doubt yourselves." Still, the impact was real. Mr. Wong found himself pacing the kitchen floor, his slippers scuffing softly against the linoleum. He thought of neighbors who might have received the same letters and given in, too embarrassed to ask for help, too frightened to question the authority implied in the wording. Each step of the scam seemed designed to play not just on fear, but on pride, exploiting the silence of people unwilling to admit confusion. More calls followed, some in the middle of the night. The phone would ring 3 or 4 times, just enough to pull Mr. Wong from shallow sleep, and then stop abruptly, leaving only the hollow buzz of the dial tone when he answered. On other nights, the voice returned, sneering now, accusing him of irresponsibility, of endangering his family. "You think your daughter will thank you when the sheriff is at the door?" The salesman hissed in one call, his tone laced with false authority. May took the receiver from her father more than once, her own voice steady but firm. "We know who you are," she said into the mouthpiece, "and we're not afraid. Call again and it goes on record." But even her strength could not erase the shadow these intrusions cast over their days. The house, once a place of quiet routines, felt watched, invaded by words that came through wires and letters slipped under doors. Elena, upon hearing of the harassment, reminded them that intimidation was often the next step in schemes like this. "It means he's desperate," she explained. "If he had confidence in his fraud, he would move on to easier prey. The anger is a sign of weakness, but it is also dangerous. Document everything, every call, every notice. Fear is his weapon, but record-keeping will be yours." So May began a file. Each paper was tucked into a folder, each call logged with date and time. She encouraged her father to see the folder not as a collection of threats, but as a growing shield, evidence building towards something larger. Mr. Wong still felt his heart race each time the phone rang. But now there was also purpose in the act of writing it down, a sense that with each page added, the salesman's grip weakened. Neighbors, too, began to speak more openly. Word of the intimidation spread across the block, and retirees who had once whispered in shame now admitted receiving the same letters, the same calls. Some brought their notices to May and Daniel, laying them out on the Wong family's kitchen table until the surface was covered in forgeries and lies. The sheer volume revealed the scale of the operation, but it also brought solidarity. No one was alone in being targeted. Together they were witnesses, not victims. The salesman's anger grew louder, but so did the resistance. His threats, once meant to isolate and frighten, now forged connections between those who shared them. Mr. Wong found a quiet strength in this, recalling the words his wife had written years ago about the house being not just walls and roof, but the center of their family's endurance. The salesman's voice, for all its bluster, was beginning to sound less like authority and more like the desperate echo of a man losing control. And though the fear lingered, there was also a growing certainty that this battle was shifting, that the intimidation meant the fight had truly begun. It began with a knock at the door one Saturday morning, but this time it was not the salesman. Instead, Mrs. Alvarez from down the street appeared with a tin of sweet bread in her hands. She told Mr. Wong she had received another letter the night before, one with the same fake seals and deadlines that had been slipped under his door. She looked tired but resolute, her gray hair tied back neatly, her voice steady as she said she didn't want to face this alone. Mr. Wong invited her in, and before long, word had spread down the block. By the afternoon, his modest home, usually so quiet, was filled with the sounds of neighbors coming together. They brought their papers, some creased from being folded into pockets, others pristine, save in the faint hope that one day they might be explained. There were envelopes bearing intimidating fonts, notices threatening action, and even crude copies of legal forms designed to confuse. Spread across the Wong kitchen table, they formed a patchwork of deceit. Each letter, once a private shame, now became part of a collective testimony. For the first time, the neighbors saw that they had all been singled out, not because of personal mistakes, but because they were considered easy prey. The living room filled quickly. Men and women who had once greeted each other only in passing now sat close, their chairs and stools pulled together in an improvised circle. Some spoke haltingly, confessing that they had nearly signed, their pens hovering over dotted lines before fear stopped them. Others admitted that they had been paying fees for months. Small amounts bled from their savings in the name of property protection. Each story, though painful, lessened the weight on the teller's shoulders, for it was no longer carried alone. May moved among them, pouring tea, steadying hands that shook not from age but from the release of long-held worry. Daniel sat with his notepad, jotting down details, the dates and phone numbers that had haunted these residents for weeks or even months. Elena, with her calm authority, guided the conversation, reminding them that scams only flourish in silence. Isolation is a scammer's best weapon, she said firmly. But here, together, you take that power back. Outside, as evening drew near, others arrived, neighbors who had heard about the gathering through phone calls and word of mouth. Soon there were too many to fit inside. Chairs were carried out to the front lawn, and lanterns were lit as the sun slipped low in the sky. The circle expanded, spreading across the yard, retirees and families sitting side by side. Children played near the porch steps while their grandparents spoke of letters and phone calls. The contrast between innocence and exploitation plain for all to see. What had once been private dread was transformed into a visible, undeniable show of unity. Passing cars slowed to take in the sight. Dozens of residents gathered around one house, speaking in low, deliberate tones, their faces illuminated by soft light. Mr. Wong sat at the center, humbled and overwhelmed. For years he had thought of himself as invisible, a quiet man who kept his routines and asked for little. Now his home had become the place where his neighbors found their voice. The salesman had tried to use fear to divide them, but in doing so, he had awakened something he could not control. No longer were these retirees isolated targets, each bearing shame in silence. They were witnesses together, a circle of resilience that made intimidation less effective with each shared word. Where one person might falter, the group provided strength. Where one voice trembled, another rose steady to meet it. As the night deepened, Daniel outlined the next steps, documenting every incident, preparing affidavits, submitting collective complaints. Elena spoke of legal precedents and protections designed to defend the elderly from exploitation. May assured them that their dignity mattered, that no one should feel embarrassed of being misled by carefully crafted lies. Each contribution, whether from young or old, became a thread woven into a larger fabric of defense. For Mr. Wong, the transformation was profound. He looked at the faces around him, etched with years of labor and sacrifice, and saw not weakness but fortitude. These were men and women who had built lives from nothing, who had survived wars, migration, and economic upheavals. That they should now be threatened in their twilight years was unjust, but they were not as fragile as the salesman believed. As the gathering drew to a close, neighbors clasped hands, promising to look out for one another. They left with lighter steps, some carrying home copies of Daniel's notes, others with renewed resolve. Wong lingered on the porch after the last chair was folded away, the night air cool against the skin. For the first time in months, he felt not the weight of impending loss, but the steady reassurance of community. His house, once a target, had become a fortress, not of walls or locks, but people bound together in defiance of fear. And in that circle, unbroken even by the darkness, the salesman's threat seemed smaller, reduced the noise of a man who had underestimated the strength of those he sought to exploit. The story began as a whisper, carried out community meeting, and into the ear of someone who still had the means to amplify voices. A young reporter named Lila Tran, who worked at a small but persistent local newspaper, had been tipped off by Daniel after he recognized the scale of what was happening. At first, she approached with skepticism. Scams aimed at retirees were not new, and too often the victims were too embarrassed to speak on record. But as she sat in Mr. Wong's living room, surrounded by stacks of fraudulent letters and contracts, the weight of the evidence silenced her doubts. These were not isolated incidents. They were the fingerprints of a coordinated enterprise designed to strip entire neighborhoods of their stability. Lila stayed long into the evening, her recorder resting on the table as neighbors, one by one, told their stories. She asked simple, steady questions. Who had knocked at the door, what was said, what papers were left behind. She photographed the forged seals and the contracts with their buried clauses. She traced the company names and found they were shells, folded within one another like a set of Russian dolls, each designed to vanish when pressure came. The salesman's face appeared again and again in their accounts, sometimes alone, sometimes with associates who carried clipboards and feigned authority. His operation had not targeted one house. It had mapped an entire demographic, A cluster of retirees living in homes paid off long ago, their names flagged by databases that should never have been sold. When Lila returned to her newsroom, the editor was hesitant. Stories like this drew legal threats, and small papers could not always bear the cost. But she pressed forward, arguing that to remain silent would mean complicity. She began digging through public records, tracing lawsuits filed years earlier in distant counties, cases that ended quietly with settlements no one reported on. She found patterns. The same company names reappearing with slight changes, the same officers listed behind them, and the same evasive language designed to mislead homeowners into signing away rights. The more she uncovered, the clearer the picture became. This was not the work of a lone con man. It was a network layered and protected by legal loopholes, feeding off fear and trust. Elderly homeowners were its chosen prey, their modest homes seen as untapped equity waiting to be siphoned. Some had already lost their properties, sold at auctions where the companies themselves placed bids. What seemed like personal misfortune became evidence of systemic exploitation. When the expose finally went to print, it did not appear buried in the back pages. It ran as a front-page feature, with photographs of contracts spread across Mr. Wong's table. With interviews quoted verbatim, their voices steady despite the pain behind them. Lila's article named the salesman, linked him to his shell companies, and showed the public record of his lawsuits. She included the words of Elena, who called it betrayal not only of individuals but of the social fabric that bound generations. Daniel's legal analysis appeared in a sidebar, breaking down the fine print in plain language, exposing how words like maintenance and protection masked the transfer of deeds. The response was immediate. Phone calls flooded the newsroom, not just from retirees in Wong's neighborhood, but from across the city. People recognizing the same names, the same phrases, the same knocks at their own doors. Some were relieved to realize they were not alone. Others furious that their silent suspicions had been correct. Community leaders demanded investigations, and council members, once dismissive of scattered complaints, were forced to address the scandal now made public. For Mr. Wong, reading the article was a moment of both shame and relief. His photograph did not appear, but his words were there, translated carefully, carrying the weight of a man who had nearly lost what he'd spent his life building. He felt exposed in a way, but also lighter, as if the burden of secrecy had been lifted from his shoulders. Neighbors brought copies of the paper to his house, some folded neatly. Others creased from being carried all day. They spoke of it not as gossip but as validation, proof that their struggles were finally seen. The salesman's name, once only whispered in fear, now appeared in headlines. His polished smile, once a massive authority, was shown for what it was, the lure of a predator. The expose did not end the battle, but it shifted the ground beneath it. No longer were retirees' isolated voices crying into silence. Their words were printed, their evidence undeniable, and their fight no longer just personal. It had become public, where the light of scrutiny made it harder for shadows to thrive. In the days that followed, copies of the newspaper lay on kitchen counters and porches across the neighborhood. Some framed the article. Others clipped it and tucked it into folders of their own evidence. For many, it was not just news but a shield, a reminder that they were no longer invisible. For the salesman, it was a first crack in an empire built on deception, a crack that would only widen as more voices joined the chorus Lila had set into motion. The letters arrived not with ceremony, but with the dry formality of official envelopes slid into mail slots and handed over by uniformed couriers. Subpoenas neatly typed, bearing the seals of court. Mr. Wong held his in trembling hands, uncertain at first if it meant danger or protection. Daniel explained softly that it was a summons, not for punishment but for truth. It meant that the story had moved beyond whispers and newspaper columns. It was now a case. The salesman, once a figure of polished confidence and control, would be required to answer for what he had done under oath, with documents and testimony pulling apart the shield he had so carefully built. For years, he had survived by staying one step ahead. When suspicion grew in one neighborhood, he shifted to another. When lawsuits appeared, he buried them under paperwork and settlements. But now the pattern had been traced, his name threaded through dozens of shell companies that no longer looked separate but interconnected, a spider's web with him at its center. Investigators began to arrive at homes across the city, collecting copies of contracts, photographing notices, listening patiently as retirees told their stories again, this time with the assurance that the law was finally listening. Financial documents surfaced from the shadows, pried loose by subpoenas and demands for disclosure. Bank records revealed transfers not only between his companies but to personal accounts, showing a trail of money skimmed off homes that had been seized under false pretenses. Checks once deposited by frightened retirees matched the names of accounts overseas. The sleek suit, the confident smile, the smooth voice, all of it began to look less like authority and more like a mask stretched thin over desperation. Mr. Wong found himself both anxious and resolute. Each paper Daniel laid out across his table revealed more of the machinery that had almost consumed him. There were forged notary stamps, deeds transferred within hours of signatures, legal jargon stacked to confuse and disorient. Seeing it laid bare was unsettling, like glimpsing the wires behind a puppet show. Yet there was a strange comfort in knowing it was all written down, traceable, no longer just a trick of conversation or persuasion. The salesman's power had always been in making people feel isolated, as if they were alone in their mistakes. But the trial promised to gather those scattered voices into something undeniable. The neighborhood held its breath. Some feared retaliation, remembering the veiled threats and sudden phone calls that had followed Wong's refusal to sign. But as subpoenas continued to appear, it became clear the net was tightening not around them but around him. Even his associate, once a loyal shadow at his side, had been called to testify. The salesman's network was no longer invisible. It was mapped in legal filings, laid open for lawyers and judges to examine. The cracks in his image showed first in small ways. He stopped arriving in his polished car, switching instead to rentals. He avoided eye contact on the street, where once he had smiled easily at anyone who passed. A photograph in the local paper showed him leaving an office building, his face hard and drawn, a far cry from the confident charm he had once wielded at Wong's doorstep. Neighbors clipped the image and passed it around as proof. He was no longer untouchable. For Wong, the approach of the trial stirred conflicting feelings. There was vindication, certainly, but also unease. Courtrooms were foreign places to him, filled with language he did not fully understand. May reassured him that he would not stand alone, that Elena and Daniel would be at his side, guiding him through each step. Still, he wondered what his late wife would think, how she would feel seeing the home they had built dragged into legal proceedings. He imagined her voice, steady and clear, telling him that justice required patience, that silence in the face of harm was a greater shame than speaking aloud. In the evenings, when the house grew quiet, he reread the letter she had left him, her handwriting still strong, her words urging him never to surrender the place they had built together. It gave him courage, even as his stomach knotted at the thought of standing before strangers to speak about what had happened. He reminded himself it was not just for him, but for all those who had signed papers under false pretenses, who had lost homes without knowing why. As the trial date drew near, the air shifted. The salesman's calls grew fewer, his threats more desperate but less convincing. Word spread that his legal team was scrambling, overwhelmed by the sudden flood of evidence. The man who had once walked so tall now seemed to shrink with each passing day, cornered not by a single opponent, but by the collective weight of those he had underestimated. The community gathered more often now, not just to prepare testimony, but to reassure one another. They rehearsed their stories, compared documents, and leaned on the quiet confidence of Elena, who explained how trials unfolded step by step. They understood that the fight was far from over, that the salesman would resist, but for the first time, they believed he could be made to answer. The trial was no longer a distant idea. It was a horizon they were approaching together, with the truth waiting to be spoken in a place where even the smoothest lies would falter under the weight of evidence. The courthouse felt colder than Mr. Wong expected. Its marble floors echoed with footsteps. Its walls carried the faint smell of paper and polish, and the ceiling lights hummed faintly as if conspiring to add tension to an already heavy day. He walked slowly, leaning slightly on May's arm, his breath steady but shallow. Daniel carried the folders, the documents they had rehearsed over and over, each page marked with tabs and notes. Elena walked with the calm presence of someone who had seen these halls countless times before, her eyes sharp but her expression softened for his sake. Together they formed a quiet unit, a line of defense against a storm that waited just beyond the wooden doors. Inside, the courtroom was hushed, yet every cough, shuffle, and creak of the benches felt magnified. At the far end, behind the polished tables, the salesman sat with his lawyer. His suit was sharp, his hair styled neatly, but something was missing. His smile, once so effortless, was strained at the corners. When he glanced toward the witnesses' benches, he no longer saw easy marks, but people staring back with resolve. For the first time, Mr. Wong noticed the faintest twitch in the man's jaw, a betrayal of nerves he had never shown on doorsteps and sidewalks. The judge entered, an older man whose robe swayed slightly as he took his seat. He surveyed the room with a practiced neutrality, but when his gaze settled on the rows of retirees in attendance, his expression seemed to sharpen. The bailiff's voice rang out, formal and steady, calling the court to order. The trial had begun. The opening statements came first. The salesman's lawyer spoke of misunderstanding, of legitimate business practices taken out of context, of opportunists seeking to destroy a man's reputation. The words were polished, the delivery confident. But Mr. Wong noticed that they floated above the surface, never touching the specifics of the accusations. When the prosecutor rose, his tone was quieter but heavier, as though each word carried weight. He spoke of patterns, of dozens of retirees approached with the same promises, of homes stripped away by clauses buried in fine print. He held up contracts, spread them across the table, and let the silence fill the room before speaking again. Daniel leaned toward Wong, whispering explanations when the language became dense with legal terms. Elena, though no longer seated on the bench herself, nodded occasionally, affirming that the case was being built carefully, step by step. May sat straight-backed, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes never leaving the salesman. For years she had feared someone like him might one day cross their doorstep, and now she watched the man face the reckoning her father had nearly been too polite to refuse. The evidence unfolded steadily. First came the contracts, magnified on screens, so the fine print could no longer hide. Clauses granting power of attorney, hidden under vague headings. Signatures collected under false pretenses. Pages that shifted ownership of property in a single sentence, disguised as routine maintenance or protection. The retirees murmured softly among themselves as they recognized the tricks, their memories confirming what the paper proved. Then came the bank records, each transaction linked to an account, each account connected to a company, each company tied back to the salesman. The trail was undeniable. What had once been scattered fragments across neighborhoods and years now lay aligned in a chain too neat to dismiss. The salesman's lawyer objected, questioned the relevance, challenged the methods, but the judge overruled most with steady firmness. The weight of the documents was too heavy to push aside. Witnesses were called. An elderly woman with shaking hands described how she had been pressured into signing after being told her taxes would rise beyond her pension. A widower explained how notices of foreclosure appeared only days after he trusted the salesman's plan. Each voice added another stone to the pile, the shape of the scheme becoming clearer with every account. Mr. Wong listened with a mixture of sorrow and relief. He heard his own story and theirs, the same fears exploited, the same reassurances whispered, the same traps disguised as kindness. He thought of his father's warnings from decades past, of tricksters who preyed on those who wanted to believe in fairness. History had not changed its methods, only its clothes. When Wong himself was called, he rose with May at his side. His voice trembled at first, but he steadied it. Recounting the day the salesman arrived, the words that had sounded like protection, but felt like pressure. He spoke of his doubts, his late wife's letter, the box of papers he had guarded, and the moment Daniel revealed the truth hidden in the fine print. The courtroom was silent as he finished, his words hanging in the air with the weight of lived truth. Through it all, the salesman sat straighter, his smirk fading with each page displayed, each testimony delivered. He tried to whisper to his lawyer, tried to maintain composure, but his eyes betrayed him. Where once they had gleamed with confidence, now they darted, unsettled, unable to meet the gaze of those who had come to see him undone. By the time the day ended, no verdict had yet been given, but the balance had shifted. The courtroom no longer saw a businessman defending his practice, but a predator cornered by the very people he had underestimated. As Wong made Daniel and Elena stepped outside into the cooling evening, the air felt lighter. The trial was not over, but something irreversible had happened within those walls. The salesman's smile, his shield of invincibility, had cracked, and once it cracked, it could not be repaired. The second day in court opened with a sense of quiet expectation. The retirees filled the benches again, some clutching folders or notes, others simply sitting with folded hands, as if their presence alone could serve as testimony. Mr. Wong sat among them, his posture straighter than the day before. May remained close, her hand occasionally brushing against his arm to remind him he was not alone. Daniel carried another stack of documents, the corners marked with slips of colored paper, each one corresponding to a section of the contracts they would hear about today. Elena, her experience radiating calm, leaned forward slightly, her eyes sharp as the proceedings began. The prosecutor rose with measured confidence. He carried a binder thick with copies of the agreements the salesman had used for years, each page meticulously marked. The court clerk distributed them to the jury, and soon the contracts that once seemed so routine and unremarkable were laid bare for all to see. On the surface, they looked simple, short agreements with titles that implied safety: homeowner protection plan, maintenance assurance contract, property tax support agreement. The salesman had known how to make danger look like reassurance. The prosecutor began slowly, reading from the first page. At the top, in bold, the words promised coverage for property maintenance and protection from tax increases. He paused to let the jury take that in. Then he guided them downward, where the fine print began. Each clause was examined with deliberate care. He highlighted a section labeled Authority for Representation. To most, it would sound like the company merely helping with paperwork. But the language, when read precisely, granted the company full power of attorney, the right to act in the homeowner's name in all legal and financial matters. The prosecutor read it aloud, each word ringing heavy in the room. The salesman's lawyer objected, claiming the clause was standard, harmless, meant to facilitate assistance. The prosecutor countered by introducing correspondence where the company had used that power of attorney to transfer deeds, file liens, and even initiate foreclosure proceedings, all without the homeowner's knowledge. He set the letters on the evidence table, each marked with the salesman's company letterhead, each signed with authority stolen through buried phrases. Line by line, the trap unfolded. Another clause appeared under payment adjustments, which allowed the company to set fees unilaterally. Retirees who thought they had signed up for a few $100s a year in maintenance found themselves billed thousands, and when they could not pay, the company had the authority to claim their homes as collateral. Again, the words were simple on the surface but devastating in practice. Daniel leaned close to Mr. Wong, whispering translations of the legal language into plain meaning, though by now Wong understood enough to hear the betrayal clearly. The courtroom grew tense as the prosecutor shifted to a third contract, this one titled Tax Relief Support. It contained a clause buried near the end, stating that in the event of unpaid obligations, ownership of the property could be transferred for stabilization purposes. He read those words slowly, then explained their impact. It meant that if a homeowner missed even a fabricated bill, the company could seize the deed outright. The retirees on the benches stirred, some gasping softly as they recognized a trick designed to disguise theft as procedure. Cross-examination moved to the salesman himself. He was called to the stand, his charm muted by the setting. His lawyer tried to shield him, objecting at each pointed question, but the judge allowed the line of inquiry. The prosecutor placed the contracts in front of him, one after another. Did he draft them? He admitted his company did. Was he aware of the clauses? He tried to deflect, saying they were standard. But when shown evidence of homeowners losing their deeds within weeks of signing, his responses faltered. He shifted in his chair, the smooth confidence he had wielded at kitchen tables and front porches now cracking under the weight of exact words and undeniable outcomes. The prosecutor asked him to read aloud the clause about transfer for stabilization purposes. His voice, once so fluid, caught slightly as he did. The courtroom listened in silence, the absurdity of the language now obvious when spoken in plain hearing. The prosecutor then asked him what homeowner, reading that phrase in a packet presented as maintenance, would understand it meant forfeiting their home. The salesman had no clear answer. Each paragraph of each contract became a nail hammered into the coffin of his defense. The jury followed closely, guided through the documents with clarity and patience. The technical language that once shielded exploitation now served as proof of intent. Every word became part of a pattern, not isolated mistakes, but a deliberate design to strip homes from a vulnerable while hiding behind a mask of professionalism. Mr. Wong felt a swell of conflicting emotions as he listened. Shame lingered at the edges, but it was increasingly drowned out by vindication. He was not weak for almost signing. He had been targeted by someone who had spent years perfecting the art of deception. May squeezed his hand gently, sensing the shift within him, the slow transformation from self-doubt to steadiness. Daniel's eyes stayed fixed on the salesman, his jaw set in quiet determination, as though he were memorizing every tactic revealed for battles he would fight in his own legal career. Elena, seasoned as she was, allowed herself the faintest smile when another clause unraveled under scrutiny, her confidence that the truth would win out reaffirmed with each page. By the time the prosecutor closed the binder, the trap was fully exposed. What had once looked like a promise of security now stood revealed as theft written in careful, deceptive strokes. The jury had heard the words, seen the clauses, and watched the salesman stumble through his justifications. The contracts, which once stripped dignity in homes from the unsuspecting, had now become the very evidence that threatened to undo him. The courtroom buzzed with a low murmur as the session adjourned, the retirees whispering to one another, not in fear this time, but in recognition of justice beginning to take shape. The final day in court drew a larger crowd than anyone expected. Word had spread far beyond the neighborhood. Reporters lined the courthouse steps, microphones poised for statements. Retirees who had never before considered stepping inside a courtroom now filled the benches, their quiet presence forming a wall of witness. They came with canes, walkers, folded newspapers tucked under arms, each face marked by years of patience and endurance. Mr. Wong walked slowly into the chamber, May supporting him at his side. Daniel carried his notes, though he knew by now the outcome no longer rested on his words, but on the evidence that had been laid bare. Elena, calm as ever, guided them toward their usual seats, her expression unreadable but her eyes steady. The salesman sat at the defense table, his polished exterior fraying at the edges. His tie hung slightly loose, his posture less assured than it had been at the start. The smirk he once wore like armor had disappeared entirely. His lawyer shuffled papers with exaggerated purpose, but no amount of paper could undo what had been exposed. The contracts dissected line by line, the testimony of retirees describing intimidation, the evidence of forged signatures and unilateral transfers. Together they formed a portrait not of a businessman, but a predator cloaked in respectability. The judge entered, her black robe sweeping behind her as the clerk called the room to order. She was a seasoned figure, not easily moved by theatrics or half-truths, and throughout the trial she had cut through objections with brisk authority. Today her expression carried the weight of finality. She spoke slowly, each word deliberate, aware that what she was about to say would echo not only in that chamber, but across the lives of those who had been caught in the web of deceit. She began by recounting the evidence. She noted the clauses buried in fine print that handed over deeds and stripped homeowners of rights. She acknowledged the testimony of experts who explained how the contracts were crafted not as safeguards, but as traps. She referenced the retirees who had stood at the witness stand, voices trembling yet clear, describing how they had been told the city might seize their homes if they did not sign. She spoke of the power of attorney clauses, the fabricated fees, and the manufactured deadlines meant to force compliance. Her voice did not rise, yet each sentence seemed to strike the defense like a gavel. The salesman's lawyer attempted to interject, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand. She reminded the court that contracts were not meant to be instruments of theft, that consent obtained through fear and deception was not consent at all. The salesman himself kept his eyes down, tapping one finger nervously against the polished wood of the table. Then came the ruling. The judge declared that the salesman's company had operated under fraudulent pretenses, systematically targeting vulnerable homeowners with contracts designed to strip them of their most valuable asset. She revoked the company's license to operate in the state, effective immediately. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. She went further, ordering full restitution to all victims who had lost money or property through these schemes. She outlined the process by which claims would be filed and damages calculated, making it clear that the retirees would not be left to navigate the bureaucracy alone. But she did not stop there. After a pause, she recommended that the case be referred to the district attorney for review of potential criminal charges. Fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy were all words that left her mouth with measured weight. For the first time, the salesman looked up, his face pale, as though he had finally recognized the gravity of what was happening. His empire of polished brochures and honeyed words had collapsed in a single judgment. The retirees shifted in their seats, some wiping at their eyes, others nodding silently. Mr. Wong felt a release of breath he had not realized he was holding. For weeks, even months, he had lived under the shadow of doubt, shame, and fear that his home might be taken from him. Now, at last, the law had spoken. May squeezed his hand, her own expression taut with both relief and anger at the thought of how close they had come to ruin. Daniel leaned back in his chair, exhausted but satisfied, the weight of his early instincts confirmed in the strongest possible way. Elena closed her eyes briefly, as if in prayer, before looking toward the judge with quiet respect. As the gavel fell, reporters hurried from the room to deliver their stories, but inside the chamber there was no rush. The retirees remained seated, allowing themselves to feel the moment. They had been treated for too long as silent victims, easy marks, shadows on the edges of legal and financial systems. Today they had taken up space, and the system had recognized their voices. The salesman was led out of the courtroom by his attorney, his head bowed, the flash of cameras catching the sheen of sweat on his forehead. His associate followed close behind, carrying a briefcase that seemed absurdly empty now that its contents, their schemes, their carefully designed contracts, had been dismantled. Mr. Wong rose slowly, leaning on his cane, and turned toward the door. He looked back once, not at the salesman, but at the judge's bench. The courthouse, with its towering ceilings and worn wooden benches, had become the place where the battle for his home ended not in loss, but in justice. He whispered something softly in Cantonese, words his wife might have spoken, a promise fulfilled. Outside, the air was bright, the sky clear. Reporters clamored for comments, but Wong said little. May answered a few questions, her voice firm, while Daniel and Elena spoke to the press about the importance of elder protection laws. The retirees stood together on the steps, their presence a quiet declaration that they were not invisible, not expendable. They had endured, and they had won. The news spread faster than anyone expected. By the time Mr. Wong returned home from the courthouse, word had already rippled through the neighborhood. People who had followed the case quietly from their porches or through whispers at the cultural center stepped out of their homes, waiting on the sidewalks as Wong's daughter helped him up the steps of his own house. There was no fanfare, no grand announcement, just a sense of recognition that something significant had taken place. His home, the small, two-story structure with fading paint and a garden that had long been his pride, was still his. The deed, once at risk of slipping away into the hands of predatory men, remained where it always belonged. Neighbors began to gather without formal invitation. Someone brought a folding table from their garage. Another brought trays of dumplings, rice cakes, and thermoses of tea. The cultural instinct to mark survival with food took over, and soon the street was dotted with folding chairs, laughter, and the murmur of voices rising in relief. For months, everyone had lived under a cloud, fearful that the knock on their door or the letter in their mailbox might mean the end of security they had worked for their entire lives. Now, seeing Mr. Wong safe, they saw a reflection of their own safety too. Children who had overheard fragments of conversations between parents played freely, running along the pavement, unaware of how close their grandparents had come to losing the roof over their heads. Teenagers who had rolled their eyes at stories of scams now leaned in, listening as the retirees shared their experiences openly, no longer weighed down by the shame that had kept them silent. What had once been whispers and hushed tones had become stories told with clarity, lessons passed from one household to the next. Mr. Wong sat on his porch, a blanket over his lap, looking out the gathering with quiet astonishment. He had never imagined his home as a center for anything beyond family dinners and New Year gatherings. But now the very space he feared losing had become the anchor for something larger. His daughter May stood beside him, speaking with neighbors, her tone full of both gratitude and determination. Daniel arrived not long after, his backpack slung over his shoulder, and was immediately pulled into conversations by retirees eager to thank him. Elena, steady and calm as always, accepted tea poured by Mrs. Chun from next door, her quiet smile betraying her satisfaction that the law had worked as it was meant to. The celebration was not grand in scale, but its meaning ran deep. It was not just about one man keeping his house. It was about the neighborhood realizing that together they were far less vulnerable than apart. For years, they had each handled their troubles quietly, treating financial struggles or intimidation as private burdens. Now they saw the power of standing side by side. The house itself seemed to reflect the moment. The garden, though a little overgrown, held late-blooming flowers that had pushed through despite neglect. The front steps, worn from decades of use, carried the weight of friends and neighbors sitting, talking, and laughing as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Wong's late wife had always said the house should remain in the family, that it carried their history within its walls. Now it carried more. It had become a symbol of solidarity, a marker of resistance against those who preyed on silence. As evening settled, lanterns were strung from one porch to another. Their glow lit up the street, creating a sense of warmth that extended beyond the physical light. The retirees, who had once looked over their shoulders with anxiety, now looked at one another with recognition. They spoke about pooling resources to educate others, about setting up regular meetings at the cultural center, about making sure no one else would ever face intimidation alone. The seeds planted during the courtroom battles were now taking root in the community itself. Mr. Wong listened to it all, his cane resting against a chair. He felt a wave of memory, of the factory years, of carrying pay envelopes home, of his wife's careful saving, of the sacrifices made to secure a place that could shelter his children. The thread almost undone it all, but the house had endured just as they had. For the first time in a long while, he felt not only relief but pride that what they built had survived a trial not of weather or time, but of greed and exploitation. When the last lantern flickered late into the night, and the neighbors began to drift back to their homes, there was no sadness in dispersing. The feeling was not of an ending, but of a beginning, the start of something stronger than before. Wong's house stood where it always had, but now it carried a new meaning. It was no longer just a place where one man lived. It was the place where an entire community discovered its strength. Inside, as May helped him to bed, Wong paused at the threshold of his bedroom. He looked once more at the worn walls and the photographs that lined the dresser. He whispered to his wife's memory, thanking her for the reminder she had left behind. And to the house itself, he gave a small nod, as if acknowledging its role in standing with him. Outside, the neighborhood rested easier than it had in months, knowing that together, they too would stand. The morning was quiet, the kind of stillness that seemed to stretch out and linger in the air before the day's rhythm began. Mr. Wong sat on his porch, the same spot where he had spent so many mornings with his wife years ago, a simple cup of tea warming his hands. The world beyond his small garden had not changed much. The buses still passed at regular intervals, neighbors still watered their flowers, children still left for school with backpacks bouncing. But for him, something felt undeniably different. His house stood as it always had, but now its presence carried the weight of a hard-won victory. He knew that a small act of resistance, quiet as it may have seemed, had rippled outward further than he ever imagined. The salesman who once pressed at his door with contracts and threats had faded, no longer a looming figure, but forgotten face in the long line of opportunists who thought they could profit from fear. Rumors said he had left the city, his company dismantled and discredited, court orders chasing after fragments of his fraudulent empire. Wong did not waste much thought on him anymore. Greed had its way of finding new masks, new scripts to lure the vulnerable. But this one had been stopped here, on this street, before this house. And that mattered. Neighbors passed by more often now, pausing at the edge of his porch to greet him, to thank him, or to simply acknowledge with a nod that he had stood when others might have given in. The words were not always grand. Sometimes just a soft "Good morning, Mr. Wong" carried more weight than long speeches. He had become without planning to, a symbol of something larger than himself. It embarrassed him at times, this attention, but as May often reminded him, it was not pride that people saw in him, it was reassurance. If he, quiet and modest as he was, could push back against the tide, then maybe they all could too. May visited more often than before, sometimes with groceries, sometimes just to sit with him under the awning of the porch as the day shifted into evening. She no longer scolded him for trying to handle everything alone, though the sadness in her eyes when she thought about how close things had come lingered. She reminded him gently that the strength he had carried for decades did not mean he needed to bear burdens in silence. In those moments, Wong felt a kind of peace, knowing that while his stand had been necessary, the legacy of it lay not in stubbornness, but in the connections it had renewed. The community had changed too. At the cultural center, workshops were now held monthly where volunteers explained the tricks of contracts, the tactics of scams, and the rights that retirees had under the law. Daniel, the law student who had been drawn into the story almost by accident, was often at the front of these sessions, speaking with a confidence that belied his youth. He never failed to nod toward Wong when he spoke, though Wong rarely stayed long enough to be singled out. Elena, the retired judge, often moderated the discussions, ensuring that legal clarity balanced with compassion. Together, they had turned fear into knowledge and silence into vigilance. Wong thought back often to his years in the factory, the long hours, the wear on his body, the pennies and dollars set aside until they amounted to enough for a down payment. Those sacrifices were the foundation of the house he still lived in, but they had also built something intangible, a reminder to everyone that perseverance and modest effort, stacked one upon the other, could create something that lasted. The house was no longer just his. It was part of the community's memory now, a reminder of what could be defended when people refused to surrender. In the evenings, when the shadows stretched across the porch and the lanterns of nearby houses flickered on, he often found himself listening to the sound of life around him, laughter from the street, footsteps on the pavement, the hum of conversation drifting across fences. All of it had a different weight now. It was no longer just the background noise of his twilight years. It was proof that what had been fought for was not abstract, but immediate, alive, and shared. He thought sometimes of his wife's letter, the one May had read aloud, urging him never to let go of their home. Her words had been more than a personal plea. They had been a call to memory, a reminder that what they had built together was meant to last. Now, sitting with tea in hand, he felt as though she had been right there with him through it all, steady and unyielding in her quiet way. The legacy was not only his, but theirs. As days passed into weeks and weeks into months, the urgency of the court case and the tension of confrontation receded, but the sense of what had been achieved remained. The salesman's name, once muttered with dread, was no longer even remembered by many. Greed had been pushed back, and what endured was resilience, community, and the quiet dignity of a man who refused to give up the place he called home. Wong knew he was just one retiree among many, but he also knew that sometimes that was enough. That one stand made at the right moment could protect countless others. He sipped his tea, watching the world move steadily along, and allowed himself the rare luxury of contentment. His house stood. His neighbors stood with him. And in the silence of the porch, he understood that his legacy was not just survival, but the reminder that even the most unassuming voice can change the course of the community.